I'm poor, but I'm not useless. Annie did not speak loudly, but her voice was clear enough to make the woman behind the recruiting desk stop laughing. I can learn, Annie continued, clutching the thin folder to her chest with both hands. I can do the smallest things, the things no one notices, until they are not done. I can organize files, make copies, clean conference rooms, answer phones, deliver documents, straighten drawers, make coffee, come in early, and stay late. I am not asking you to give me a title. I am only asking for a chance to prove that I am not useless. For a moment, the grand lobby of Reed Global Technologies seemed to grow still around her. Then Marcia Bell laughed. This time, she did not even bother to hide it. Marcia was the head of human resources, a woman in a cream-colored suit with thick framed glasses and a smile that was polite enough to be cold. She held Annie's resume between two fingers, glanced over it one more time, then dropped it sharply onto the middle of the desk. The folder fell open. A few pages slid out. You have no qualifications at all, Marcia said. Annie stood still. No college degree, no internship, no office experience, no professional recommendation from anyone with influence. Marcia tapped the paper lightly, with one polished fingernail. And yet you are standing here telling me you are not useless? A young female HR assistant sitting nearby let out a quiet laugh. Annie felt her face grow hot, but she did not let go of the folder. She had promised her mother she would never let anyone force her to lower her head and beg. I am not saying I know everything, Annie said. I am only saying I can learn. Marcia leaned back in her chair and slowly looked Annie over. From her worn black shoes to the second-hand coat she had carefully ironed the night before. Marcia's eyes moved over the faded cuffs, the cheap buttons, and the careful stitching where one sleeve had once been torn. Learning is what people do before they apply here, Marcia said. I have been learning my whole life. Not the kind of learning that matters in a company like this. Annie looked down at the folder lying open on the desk. Inside were her resume, a copy of her high school transcript, and a short recommendation letter from the manager of the grocery store where she had worked. He had written that she was reliable, honest, and had never once been late. To Marcia, those words meant nothing, but to Annie, they were proof that at least one person had seen her work and had not looked down on it. I worked as a cashier for almost 2 years, Annie said. I handled money, counted change, and dealt with difficult customers before they had the chance to get angry. I stocked shelves when deliveries came late. I counted inventory by hand when the scanner broke. I watched 3 children after school for a mother who worked double shifts. I helped her keep track of appointments, school forms, grocery lists, and medication schedules. Marcia's face did not soften. Annie continued, her voice still calm. I helped my mother clean offices at night. I learned which desks should not be touched, which papers had to stay exactly where they were, and which doors needed to be locked twice before we left. I learned how to notice when something was out of place, and I learned how to finish what I started, even when I was so tired I wanted to sit down on the floor. The young HR assistant was no longer laughing. Marcia only sighed. Those may be respectable jobs, she said, but they are not corporate experience. They are responsibility. That is still not enough. Annie swallowed the answer rising in her throat. I am willing to start at the lowest position, she said. Give me the smallest job in this building, the job no one else wants to do. I will do it right. Marcia folded her hands on the desk. Miss Brooks, this is Reed Global Technologies. We do not hire people simply because they are willing. We hire people because they are capable. I am capable. Annie wanted to say it, but Marcia spoke first. No, she said, her voice lower now, but colder. You are hoping. There is a difference. A few steps away from Annie, other applicants were waiting for their turn. They wore neat suits, carried leather briefcases, held laptops, and had the confident expressions of people who were used to walking into buildings like this. A man in a navy coat looked at his watch and sighed. Is this going to take much longer? He asked, without even looking directly at Annie. Some of us have real interviews. A woman with a silver laptop bag muttered, She is wasting everyone's time. Annie heard it. Marcia heard it too, but she did not correct them. If anything, the impatience of the room seemed to make Marcia even colder. You see, Marcia said, gesturing toward the line of waiting applicants. These people came prepared. They have degrees. They have experience. They understand what kind of company this is. And you are standing here talking about babysitting, grocery lists, and cleaning offices, as if that qualifies you to work beside executives. Annie's fingers tightened around the strap of her bag. I was only answering your question. You were telling your life story, Marcia said, and this is not the place for that. The man in the navy coat gave a small laugh. Exactly. This is a company, not a charity office. Annie turned slightly toward him. I am not asking for charity. No? The woman with the laptop bag looked Annie up and down. You walked in here dressed like that and expected an office job? The words hurt more than Annie expected. Marcia's eyes dropped once again to Annie's coat. This time, she did not bother to hide her contempt. Appearance matters here, Miss Brooks, she said. Clients walk through this lobby. Senior partners walk through this lobby. We cannot place someone in an executive environment when she looks as if she does not even have confidence in herself. Annie looked down at her coat. Her mother had stayed up late to press it flat. Grace had clipped a loose thread from the sleeve, stepped back, and said, You look like someone who is about to walk into an important place. Annie lifted her head. My clothes are clean, she said. Clean does not mean professional. My work will be professional. You have not had the chance to prove that. Annie's chest tightened, but her voice remained steady. Then how is anyone supposed to get a chance if no one allows them to begin? The smile disappeared from Marcia's face. Miss Brooks, that is enough. At Reed Global, we hire capable people. You do not meet the standard. You have no degree, no training, no experience, no connections, and no relevant background. And now you are holding up qualified applicants with a speech about your hardships. Please leave. Annie did not move. Marcia turned toward the security desk. Mr. Collins, she called. Please escort Miss Brooks out. The older security guard near the main entrance looked up. His name tag read Collins. His expression tightened slightly. He walked over slowly, not rudely, and not in a hurry. Miss, he said softly, come on. Annie looked at him, then at Marcia. I will go, she said. No one needs to drag me out. No one said anything about dragging you, Marcia replied. You just called security. Because you refuse to understand that this interview is over. Annie slowly gathered the pages that had fallen loose. She stacked them neatly, pressing the edges together, trying not to let her hands shake in front of Marcia. Someone in the waiting line muttered, Finally. Annie heard that too. Mr. Collins stepped beside her, keeping just enough distance to let her know he did not see her as a criminal. Are you all right? He asked quietly. Yes, sir, Annie replied. He did not believe her, but he did not embarrass her by saying so. It is cold outside, he said. Button your coat before you go out. Yes, sir. That small kindness almost hurt Annie more than Marcia's laughter. She turned toward the exit. Mr. Collins walked beside her. They passed the last recruiting table, where several executive appointment folders had been stacked neatly. It was not a table meant for applicants like Annie. It was a table for insiders, for people upstairs, for people whose names could open doors before their hands ever touched the handle. A gust of wind from the revolving door swept into the lobby and lifted the top page of one folder. By instinct, Annie reached out and held it down before it could slide off the edge of the table. Miss Brooks, Marcia snapped from behind her. Do not touch company documents. Annie froze. Her eyes had stopped on the name at the bottom of the page. Jonathan Reed, the founder, the billionaire. The man whose face appeared on the screens throughout the lobby, beside words like integrity, innovation, and leadership. Annie did not know him, but she knew his signature. Her mother had once kept an old thank you letter from Jonathan Reed in a clear plastic sleeve under her bed, beside Annie's birth certificate and a few family photographs. Grace had received that letter years ago, when she was still working in the records department at Reed Global, when she came home tired but proud, not tired and silent the way she had in her final years. This letter proves I mattered there once, Grace used to say. Annie had seen that signature hundreds of times. The first stroke was strong, the slant was slight, the final curve dipped down and then lifted quickly, as if the pen had left the page in a familiar hurry. But the signature on this appointment folder did not lift that way. It ended in a hard, cold, straight line. Annie leaned closer. Marcia came around the desk, her voice sharpening. I told you not to touch that. This signature is wrong, Annie said. The man in the navy coat scoffed. Now she is a handwriting expert? The woman with the laptop bag shook her head. Unbelievable. Marcia's voice turned harsh. Miss Brooks, this is no longer funny. It was never funny, Annie said. Mr. Collins looked from Annie to the paper. What do you mean it is wrong? Annie opened her bag and took out the old letter, still carefully protected inside its clear plastic sleeve. She had brought it with her only in case someone asked whether her mother had really worked there. She had not expected to use it like this. Annie placed the letter beside the appointment folder before Marcia could stop her. This is the real signature, she said, pointing to the old letter. Then she pointed to the new folder. And that one is fake. This time, no one laughed. Marcia stared at the two signatures. For the first time that morning, her face seemed unable to decide what expression to wear. Put it away, Marcia said. Annie did not move. Why? Because you are touching internal documents without permission. I was only keeping the paper from falling onto the floor. You touched a file that has nothing to do with you. Annie looked down at the appointment folder, then lifted her eyes back to Marcia. If someone is signing Mr. Reed's name without his knowledge, then this has something to do with the entire company. The man in the navy coat let out a small breath through his nose. This time, it no longer sounded like laughter. The woman with the silver laptop bag looked from the old letter to the new folder, and her expression began to change. Mr. Collins remained beside Annie. He did not take her arm. He did not tell her to keep walking. His eyes stayed fixed on the two papers on the desk, and Annie could tell he was thinking the same thing she was. The two signatures were not the same. Marcia lowered her voice. Miss Brooks, you are making a very serious accusation. I'm only saying what I see. You were rejected from an entry-level interview less than 5 minutes ago. That doesn't change what I saw. It changes whether anyone in this building is required to listen to you. Those words were clearly meant to push Annie back into the place Marcia believed she belonged. But Annie had spent too many years watching her mother swallow pain into silence. She looked down at the old thank you letter. The plastic sleeve had yellowed around the edges. Grace Brooks had touched that letter so many times that the crease down the middle had grown soft. My mother kept this letter for years, Annie said, not because it was worth money, but because it reminded her that someone had once known she did her job well. If Annie's story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, and share your thoughts about Annie and her mother's letter. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Marcia clenched her jaw. This has nothing to do with your mother. Yes, it does, Annie said, because my mother's letter is the reason I know that signature is wrong. A young female HR assistant, whose name tag read Claire, stepped half a step closer. She stopped almost immediately, but not before Marcia noticed. Claire, Marcia said coldly. Claire straightened at once. Yes, ma'am. Go back to your desk. Claire hesitated. Should we call someone from legal? Marcia turned sharply toward her. No. Just then, a man stepped out from the elevator corridor. He slowed when he saw the crowd gathered around the recruiting desk. He wore a company badge around his neck and carried a tablet under one arm. His suit was not as expensive as the ones worn by senior executives, but his presence made it clear that he belonged on the upper floors of the building. What is going on here? He asked. Marcia answered before anyone else could. A rejected applicant is refusing to leave and interfering with company documents. The man looked at Annie, then at Mr. Collins, and then down at the two papers on the desk. What documents? David, Marcia said, her tone changing noticeably. This is being handled. Annie looked at his name badge. David Ellis, Executive Office. Sir, Annie said. I think Mr. Reed's signature has been copied. David's eyes sharpened immediately. Marcia gave a dry, humorless laugh. That is exactly the kind of irresponsible statement I am trying to stop. David stepped closer to the desk. Let me see. Marcia placed her hand on the appointment folder. This is an internal document. I work in the executive office, David said. Move your hand. For a moment, Marcia did not obey. Then, slowly, she lifted her hand. David did not touch the folder right away. He leaned down and studied the old letter beside the new set of papers. Annie watched his face. She had seen plenty of people pretend to examine something just to be polite, but David was not pretending. Where did you get this letter? He asked. From my mother, Annie replied. Grace Brooks. She worked in the records department here years ago. David looked up. Grace Brooks? You knew my mother? I know the name. His eyes returned to the letter. Records department. Old legal archive. She once caught a contract issue before the Anderson case went to court. Marcia's mouth opened slightly, then closed again. Something inside Annie became steadier. Her mother had not imagined that past. She had not exaggerated it just to hold on to the last piece of pride she had left. Someone still remembered. David looked back at the two signatures. Who prepared this appointment packet? Claire glanced at Marcia. Marcia's voice turned ice cold. David, this kind of conversation is not appropriate in the lobby. No, David said. Faking executive approval is what is not appropriate in the lobby, or anywhere else. The man in the navy coat stopped checking his watch. David took out his phone. Marcia stepped toward him at once. Do not take this upstairs without the proper context, she said. I'm taking it upstairs because of the context. Jonathan is preparing for the board meeting. Then he needs to know before the board does. Marcia's face stiffened when she heard the name. Not Mr. Reed. Jonathan. David had access Marcia could not control. He made the call. Annie stood motionless as the phone rang. Suddenly, she became painfully aware of her own breathing, of her mother's old letter lying exposed under the cold, bright lights of the lobby, and of Mr. Collins standing close enough to help if she needed him, but far enough away that she did not feel guarded. She wondered what her mother would say if she could see this. Maybe Grace would tell her to stop. Maybe she would tell her to go home. Or maybe she would look at that forged signature and fall silent, the way she always had whenever an old wound was touched. David spoke into the phone. I need Mr. Reed in the lobby. Right now. A pause. Yes, right now. It concerns his signature on Pierce's appointment packet. The name passed across Marcia's face like a shadow. Wait. Annie caught it, even though she still did not understand why it mattered. David ended the call and looked at Annie. Don't go anywhere. Marcia snapped immediately. She is being escorted out. Not anymore. The applicants waiting for their interviews said nothing. A few employees passing through the lobby stopped near the security gate, sensing that something was wrong even if they did not yet know what it was. Claire stood behind the HR desk, pale and silent. Annie looked at David. Am I in trouble? David answered carefully. That depends on whether you are wrong. And if I'm right? David looked down at the appointment folder. Then a lot of people are going to be in trouble. But you won't be one of them. The private elevator on the far side of the lobby opened. The air seemed to change before Jonathan Reed even stepped out. He came with two executives beside him. Both of them were still speaking until they saw his face. Then they fell silent at once. Jonathan's hair was silver at the temples. His charcoal suit fit him perfectly. His face revealed very little emotion, but his eyes moved quickly. Marcia, David, Mr. Collins, Annie, the old letter, the appointment folder. Marcia straightened as if an invisible string had been pulled tight through her spine. Mr. Reed, she said. I apologize for this inconvenience. We have a confused applicant who was rejected earlier. Jonathan did not look at her. He looked at Annie. You are the one who noticed the signature? Annie's mouth went dry, but she nodded. Yes, sir. What is your name? Annie Brooks. Something passed across his face. Not recognition exactly, but the beginning of it. And this letter? Annie touched the edge of the plastic sleeve. It belonged to my mother, Grace Brooks. You signed that letter for her. Jonathan looked down. For the first time since he had entered the lobby, the calmness on his face shifted. Not much, just enough for Annie to notice. He carefully picked up the old letter, as though the paper weighed more than it appeared to. His eyes moved over the company letterhead, the date, the typed lines, and finally stopped at the signature at the bottom of the page. I remember this, he said quietly. Marcia's face went pale. Jonathan placed the letter beside the appointment folder and examined both signatures carefully. The entire lobby waited. Annie said nothing more. She had already said what she had seen. Now the truth had to stand on its own without her pushing it another step. Jonathan's jaw tightened. David, he said. Yes, sir. Who approved this packet for review today? David glanced at Marcia, then looked down at the documents. It came through Human Resources and Operations. Jonathan slowly raised his head. And by operations, you mean Calvin Pierce? No one answered quickly enough. Jonathan's eyes returned to the forged signature. Then he spoke. His voice calm but final. Cancel the board preparation session. Seal every appointment file scheduled for review today. No one edits, deletes, rescans, or destroys a single page. Marcia tried to speak. Mr. Reed, I truly think. Jonathan turned to her. I did not ask what you think. The grand lobby fell silent again. This time Annie understood why. Jonathan Reed was no longer looking at the file of a rejected applicant. He was looking at the first trace of a betrayal. Marcia stared at the two signatures. For the first time that morning, her face seemed unable to decide what expression to wear. "Put it away," Marcia said. Annie did not move. "Why?" "Because you are touching internal documents without permission. I was only keeping the paper from falling onto the floor. You touched a file that has nothing to do with you." Annie looked down at the appointment folder, then lifted her eyes back to Marcia. "If someone is signing Mr. Reed's name without his knowledge, then this has something to do with the entire company." The man in the navy coat let out a small breath through his nose. This time, it no longer sounded like laughter. The woman with the silver laptop bag looked from the old letter to the new folder, and her expression began to change. Mr. Collins remained beside Annie. He did not take her arm. He did not tell her to keep walking. His eyes stayed fixed on the two papers on the desk, and Annie could tell he was thinking the same thing she was. The two signatures were not the same. Marcia lowered her voice. "Miss Brooks, you are making a very serious accusation. I'm only saying what I see. You were rejected from an entry-level interview less than 5 minutes ago. That doesn't change what I saw. It changes whether anyone in this building is required to listen to you." Those words were clearly meant to push Annie back into the place Marcia believed she belonged. But Annie had spent too many years watching her mother swallow pain into silence. She looked down at the old thank you letter. The plastic sleeve had yellowed around the edges. Grace Brooks had touched that letter so many times that the crease down the middle had grown soft. "My mother kept this letter for years," Annie said. "Not because it was worth money, but because it reminded her that someone had once known she did her job well." Marcia clenched her jaw. "This has nothing to do with your mother." "Yes, it does," Annie said, "because my mother's letter is the reason I know that signature is wrong." A young female HR assistant, whose name tag read Claire, stepped half a step closer. She stopped almost immediately, but not before Marcia noticed. "Claire," Marcia said coldly. Claire straightened at once. "Yes, ma'am. Go back to your desk." Claire hesitated. "Should we call someone from legal?" Marcia turned sharply toward her. "No." Just then, a man stepped out from the elevator corridor. He slowed when he saw the crowd gathered around the recruiting desk. He wore a company badge around his neck and carried a tablet under one arm. His suit was not as expensive as the ones worn by senior executives, but his presence made it clear that he belonged on the upper floors of the building. "What is going on here?" he asked. Marcia answered before anyone else could. "A rejected applicant is refusing to leave and interfering with company documents." The man looked at Annie, then at Mr. Collins, and then down at the two papers on the desk. "What documents?" "David," Marcia said, her tone changing noticeably. "This is being handled." Annie looked at his name badge. "David Ellis, Executive Office." "Sir," Annie said, "I think Mr. Reed's signature has been copied." David's eyes sharpened immediately. Marcia gave a dry, humorless laugh. "That is exactly the kind of irresponsible statement I am trying to stop." David stepped closer to the desk. "Let me see." Marcia placed her hand on the appointment folder. "This is an internal document. I work in the executive office," David said. "Move your hand." For a moment, Marcia did not obey. Then, slowly, she lifted her hand. David did not touch the folder right away. He leaned down and studied the old letter beside the new set of papers. Annie watched his face. She had seen plenty of people pretend to examine something just to be polite. But David was not pretending. "Where did you get this letter?" he asked. "From my mother," Annie replied. "Grace Brooks. She worked in the records department here years ago." David looked up. "Grace Brooks? You knew my mother?" "I know the name." His eyes returned to the letter. "Records department. Old legal archive. She once caught a contract issue before the Anderson case went to court." Marcia's mouth opened slightly, then closed again. Something inside Annie became steadier. Her mother had not imagined that past. She had not exaggerated it just to hold on to the last piece of pride she had left. Someone still remembered. David looked back at the two signatures. "Who prepared this appointment packet?" Claire glanced at Marcia. Marcia's voice turned ice cold. "David, this kind of conversation is not appropriate in the lobby." "No," David said. "Faking executive approval is what is not appropriate in the lobby, or anywhere else." The man in the navy coat stopped checking his watch. David took out his phone. Marcia stepped toward him at once. Do not take this upstairs without the proper context, she said. I'm taking it upstairs because of the context. Jonathan is preparing for the board meeting. Then he needs to know before the board does. Marcia's face stiffened when she heard the name. Not Mr. Reed. Jonathan. David had access Marcia could not control. He made the call. Annie stood motionless as the phone rang. Suddenly, she became painfully aware of her own breathing, of her mother's old letter lying exposed under the cold, bright lights of the lobby, and of Mr. Collins standing close enough to help if she needed him, but far enough away that she did not feel guarded. She wondered what her mother would say if she could see this. Maybe Grace would tell her to stop. Maybe she would tell her to go home. Or maybe she would look at that forged signature and fall silent, the way she always had whenever an old wound was touched. David spoke into the phone. I need Mr. Reed in the lobby. Right now. A pause. Yes, right now. It concerns his signature on Pierce's appointment packet. The name passed across Marcia's face like a shadow. Wait. Annie caught it, even though she still did not understand why it mattered. David ended the call and looked at Annie. Don't go anywhere. Marcia snapped immediately. She is being escorted out. Not anymore. The applicants waiting for their interviews said nothing. A few employees passing through the lobby stopped near the security gate, sensing that something was wrong even if they did not yet know what it was. Claire stood behind the HR desk, pale and silent. Annie looked at David. Am I in trouble? David answered carefully. That depends on whether you are wrong. And if I'm right? David looked down at the appointment folder. Then a lot of people are going to be in trouble, but you won't be one of them. The private elevator on the far side of the lobby opened. The air seemed to change before Jonathan Reed even stepped out. He came with two executives beside him. Both of them were still speaking until they saw his face. Then they fell silent at once. Jonathan's hair was silver at the temples. His charcoal suit fit him perfectly. His face revealed very little emotion, but his eyes moved quickly. Marcia, David, Mr. Collins, Annie, the old letter, the appointment folder. Marcia straightened as if an invisible string had been pulled tight through her spine. Mr. Reed, she said, I apologize for this inconvenience. We have a confused applicant who was rejected earlier. Jonathan did not look at her. He looked at Annie. You are the one who noticed the signature? Annie's mouth went dry, but she nodded. Yes, sir. What is your name? Annie Brooks. Something passed across his face. Not recognition exactly, but the beginning of it. And this letter? Annie touched the edge of the plastic sleeve. It belonged to my mother, Grace Brooks. You signed that letter for her. Jonathan looked down. For the first time since he had entered the lobby, the calmness on his face shifted. Not much, just enough for Annie to notice. He carefully picked up the old letter, as though the paper weighed more than it appeared to. His eyes moved over the company letterhead, the date, the typed lines, and finally stopped at the signature at the bottom of the page. I remember this, he said quietly. Marcia's face went pale. Jonathan placed the letter beside the appointment folder and examined both signatures carefully. The entire lobby waited. Annie said nothing more. She had already said what she had seen. Now the truth had to stand on its own without her pushing it another step. Jonathan's jaw tightened. David, he said. Yes, sir. Who approved this packet for review today? David glanced at Marcia, then looked down at the documents. It came through Human Resources and Operations. Jonathan slowly raised his head. And by operations you mean Calvin Pierce? No one answered quickly enough. Jonathan's eyes returned to the forged signature. Then he spoke, his voice calm but final. Cancel the board preparation session. Seal every appointment file scheduled for review today. No one edits, deletes, rescans, or destroys a single page. Marcia tried to speak. Mr. Reed, I truly think. Jonathan turned to her. I did not ask what you think. The grand lobby fell silent again. This time, Annie understood why. Jonathan Reed was no longer looking at the file of a rejected applicant. He was looking at the first trace of a betrayal. Jonathan Reed did not raise his voice. He did not have to. The people around him moved, because they understood that the quietest order from the right man could weigh more than shouting. David, take these documents to conference room B, he said. Not my office. Not HR. Conference room B. I want legal, internal audit, and its security there in 10 minutes. David picked up the appointment packet and the old letter with both hands. Yes, sir. Jonathan looked at Mr. Collins. Please stay with Miss Brooks. The guard nodded. Of course, Mr. Reed. Marcia stepped forward, her smile trying to return and failing halfway. Mr. Reed, with respect, this has gotten far beyond what it is. She was already declined for a position. There may be a misunderstanding, but bringing her into an internal review would be highly irregular. Jonathan finally turned to her fully. So is finding my signature on a document I don't remember signing. Marcia's mouth closed. Annie stood with her folder pressed against her side, aware of every stare in the lobby. The waiting applicants no longer looked annoyed. They looked uncomfortable. The way people looked when a joke they had joined suddenly became evidence against them. Jonathan's eyes returned to Annie. Did anyone ask you to look at that packet? No, sir. Did anyone give you permission to handle company documents? No, sir. The page started to slide off the table. I caught it. And then? I saw your name. You recognized my signature? I recognized what it wasn't. A faint change crossed his face. That's an unusual answer. It's the honest one. For the first time, Jonathan seemed to study her beyond the moment. Her worn blazer, the folder, the way she held herself after being laughed at, dismissed, and nearly escorted out. He had built a company that claimed to value attention to detail, yet the only person who had noticed the wrong detail was someone HR had thrown away before lunch. Come with us, he said. Marcia reacted at once. Mr. Reed, she is not an employee. I know. She has no clearance. She won't be alone with anything. She has no background check. Jonathan's voice stayed calm. Then have someone start one. Annie blinked. Sir, you made an observation. I want to know whether it holds. Marcia folded her arms. And if it doesn't? Jonathan looked at her. Then we will know we checked. That ended the argument, at least in public. Mr. Collins walked beside Annie as they followed Jonathan toward the elevators. Not close enough to shame her, just close enough to make sure no one else tried to push her aside. Annie noticed and was grateful for it. She also noticed Marcia walking behind them with stiff steps, her heels clicking harder than before. Inside the elevator, no one spoke for several seconds. Annie watched the numbers rise. The lobby disappeared below them. But the humiliation did not. It stayed under her skin, the folder hitting the table, the applicants muttering, Marcia's eyes on her blazer. Jonathan broke the silence. Grace Brooks is your mother? Yes, sir. How is she? The question caught Annie off guard. She had expected doubt, maybe suspicion, but not that. She works nights, Annie said, cleaning offices, some weeks more than others. Jonathan looked at the elevator doors. She was good at records. She still is. She remembers where everything is, even in our apartment. Bills, receipts, old letters, medicine papers. She can tell when something has been moved. She always could. Annie turned slightly. Then why did she leave? Jonathan did not answer right away. That silence told Annie more than a quick answer would have. He either did not know or did not want to say in front of everyone. I don't have the full answer, he said. My mother does. The elevator doors opened before he could respond. Conference room B sat behind frosted glass on a floor Annie had never expected to see. The carpet softened every step. The walls held framed photographs of company milestones, ribbon cuttings, product launches, charity dinners, smiling executives shaking hands with politicians. Annie saw Jonathan's face in many of them, younger in each picture, darker hair, same controlled eyes. Inside the room, David placed the documents on the table. A few people arrived quickly. A woman from legal named Patricia Sloan, a gray-haired internal auditor named Robert Haynes, and two IT security staff with laptops. Robert moved slower than the others but looked more awake than all of them. Marcia entered last and took a seat as if she belonged at the head of the table. Jonathan remained standing. Before anyone speaks, he said, no document leaves this room. No one calls operations. No one alerts Calvin Pierce until I say so. Patricia looked up sharply. Calvin is tied to the appointment packet. His division submitted it. Marcia said, Operations submits many packets. That proves nothing. Robert Haynes took out a pair of reading glasses. No one said it proved anything. Jonathan nodded toward Annie. Miss Brooks noticed a discrepancy between my signature on this packet and an older letter I signed to her mother. Robert, I want you to look first. Robert glanced at Annie, not unkindly, but with the practical skepticism of a man who had spent decades watching people confuse feelings with facts. You mind if I ask what you saw? Annie came closer to the table. The ending. The ending? She pointed without touching the paper. On the old letter, the last stroke drops a little and curves up, like the pen was leaving fast. On this one, it goes straight. It stops like someone was careful not to mess up. Robert leaned over the papers. He did not agree. He did not dismiss her. He looked. That alone felt different. Patricia studied the letterhead. This thank you letter appears authentic. Old stationery. Correct formatting for the period. Marcia gave a thin sigh. Old stationery can be copied. Jonathan looked at her. The question is not whether the old letter is fake. I remember signing it. That quiet statement removed one wall from the room. Robert compared the signatures for almost a full minute. Then he removed his glasses, wiped them, and put them back on. Well, he said. Patricia looked at him. Well, what? I wouldn't call this conclusive. Robert pointed to the appointment packet. But I would not call it clean either. Marcia's chair made a soft sound as she shifted. Signatures vary. People age. Hands change. Robert nodded. They do. But habits remain longer than people think. Jonathan folded his hands on the back of a chair. Pull the last 12 months of appointment approvals with my wet signature and digital authorization. One of the IT staff typed quickly. That may take some time. Take it. Marcia leaned forward. Mr. Reed. May I remind everyone that we have candidates waiting, board preparation delayed, and senior staffing decisions on hold, because an applicant with no credentials made a visual guess. Annie felt the old sting again, but before she could speak, Robert did. Credentials didn't catch it, he said. The room went still. Robert did not look proud of the line. He simply said it because it was true. Jonathan turned to Annie. Tell me exactly what happened downstairs. So she did. She told him about the interview, the resume, Marcia throwing the folder onto the table, the applicants complaining, the security call, the page lifting in the draft. She did not make herself sound braver than she felt. She did not soften Marcia's words either. Marcia interrupted once. That is not an accurate characterization. Jonathan looked at Annie. Continue. And Annie did. When she finished, Jonathan did not react immediately. He looked at Marcia, then at the folder still in Annie's hand. May I see your resume? He asked. Annie hesitated. No one had asked for it gently that morning. She handed it over. Jonathan read it in silence. Grocery cashier, inventory help, childcare, night cleaning with mother, high school graduate, no college. Marcia said, as I explained, it does not meet the assistant criteria. Jonathan kept reading. Dependable, honest, never late, he said, quoting the reference letter. That is admirable, Marcia replied, but not sufficient. No, Jonathan said, not by itself. Annie lowered her eyes. Then he added, but insufficient does not mean worthless. The words settled in Annie's chest before she could stop them. She looked up. One of the IT staff turned his laptop toward the table. Mr. Reed, we pulled 3 recent appointment packets. 2 have digital approvals only. 1 has a scanned signature. Robert moved closer, put it side by side. The screen showed another version of Jonathan Reed's name. Annie saw it immediately. Same straight ending. She did not speak at first. She looked at Robert. He was already looking at her. How many? Jonathan asked. The IT staff typed again, searching scanned signatures tied to appointments now. A quiet minute passed. Then the number appeared. 7. Patricia's expression changed. Robert leaned back slowly. David stopped taking notes. Marcia said nothing. Jonathan looked at the screen, and something in him hardened. Freeze all pending appointments with my signature, he said. Patricia nodded. I recommend we document the basis first. Document it after. Freeze them now. The IT staff began typing. Marcia stood. This is reckless. You cannot suspend executive movement across departments without notifying operations. Jonathan's eyes did not leave the screen. Watch me. Annie stood at the edge of the room, still holding her thin folder, still wearing the blazer they had mocked. Less than an hour ago, she had been told she was wasting everyone's time. Now the room had gone quiet around something she had seen. Jonathan finally turned to her. Miss Brooks, he said, you will remain available to internal audit today. Marcia's head snapped toward him. Absolutely not. Jonathan's voice lowered. Marcia, She stopped. He continued. Give her a visitor badge for this floor and a chair in the audit room. Annie stared at him. Sir, I'm not hired. No, Jonathan said. Not yet. The last two words landed harder than she expected. Robert gave the smallest nod, as if that was good enough for now. Jonathan picked up the old thank you letter and handed it back to Annie with care. Your mother kept this all these years? He asked. Yes, sir. Then we will treat it with the respect she did. Annie slipped the letter back into her bag. Her hands were steadier now. Outside the conference room, beyond the frosted glass, Reed Global kept moving, as if nothing had changed. Phones rang. Elevators opened. Assistants carried coffee and tablets and sealed folders. But somewhere inside the walls of the company, a line had been crossed, and for the first time, someone poor enough to be ignored had been close enough to see it. Jonathan looked to David. Find out who prepared those 7 packets. David nodded. Yes, sir. And David? Yes? No one warns Calvin Pierce. Marcia's face tightened again, but she said nothing. Annie heard the name once more and remembered the shadow that had passed over Marcia downstairs when David said it. Calvin Pierce. Operations. She did not know him yet, but she knew one thing. Whoever had forged Jonathan Reed's signature had not done it for a small reason. The audit room was smaller than the conference room, and colder in a way Annie could not explain. Maybe it was the gray carpet, or the long table covered with file boxes, or the fact that everyone inside seemed trained not to waste a breath. There were no framed awards here, no smiling photographs, no polished slogans about integrity, just paper, screens, coffee cups, and people who knew that the truth usually arrived tired and badly organized. David Ellis held the door for Annie. You can sit there, he said, pointing to the last chair near the wall. The chair looked like an afterthought, pulled from some other room, but Annie sat without complaint. A few hours earlier, she had been told to step outside. A chair was not a job, but it was not nothing. Robert Haynes came in behind her carrying a file box against his hip. He set it down with a grunt and looked at Annie over his reading glasses. You eat anything today? The question caught her off guard. I'm fine. That wasn't what I asked. Annie hesitated. Not much. Robert opened a drawer near the coffee machine and pulled out a granola bar. He tossed it gently across the table. Audit work is boring until it isn't. Eat before it isn't. Annie caught it with both hands. Thank you, sir. He gave a small nod, as if manners were expected but not to be made a ceremony of. Then he turned to the others. We start with the 7 packets. Print copies only. No one works from a live file unless IT mirrors it first. One of the IT staff, a thin man named Eric, lifted his hand. Already making forensic copies. Good, Robert said. And get me the routing logs. Who opened what? Who approved what? Who touched the files before they landed in HR? Marcia Bell stood near the door, arms folded. She had followed them down, though no one had invited her to sit. Her face had regained some of its control, but the control looked thinner now, stretched over anger. I still object to her presence, Marcia said. Robert did not look up from the box. Noted. This room contains confidential personnel documents. Then stop saying sensitive things in front of her. David covered a cough. Annie looked down at the granola bar so no one would see the corner of her mouth move. Marcia ignored Robert and turned to Jonathan, who had just entered. Mr. Reed, this is exactly how internal reviews lose credibility. We cannot allow an outsider to influence the process. Jonathan stood at the end of the table. She is not influencing the process. She is answering questions. She has no training. Robert opened the first folder. Neither did the person who forged the signature, apparently. Marcia's face tightened. Jonathan looked at Annie. Miss Brooks, you'll only see what Mr. Haynes places in front of you. You will not copy, photograph, or remove anything. Is that clear? Yes, sir. If you do not understand something, say so. I will. If you feel pressured by anyone in this room, you tell Mr. Haynes or David. Marcia looked offended. Pressed by whom? Jonathan did not answer her. That was answer enough. The work began slowly. It was not dramatic, not at first. Folders opened. Pages were removed, logged, scanned, compared. Eric pulled access histories. Patricia from legal made notes in clean, narrow handwriting. David built a timeline on a yellow legal pad. the kind older executives still trusted more than software when things turned serious. Annie was given copies of 3 signatures at a time. Robert asked her not to decide quickly. "Don't hunt for what you want to find," he told her. "Look until the paper gets boring, then look again." Annie understood that. Her mother had taught her something similar while cleaning offices. The first pass showed what people left behind. The second showed what they tried to hide. She studied the first set. One looked real, messier than the letter, but alive. The line moved with confidence. The second looked uncertain, but not false, maybe signed in a hurry. The third had the same stiff ending she had seen downstairs. "This one," she said, touching the edge of the page but not the ink. "It stops wrong." Robert leaned over. "Why?" "It's careful at the wrong place, like the person was scared of finishing it." He did not praise her. He marked the page with a red tab and passed her another set. After an hour, the room had changed around Annie. No one had announced it, but people had stopped looking at her like an interruption. Eric began sliding printed samples toward her without being told. Patricia asked, "Can you compare this one against the old letter?" David stopped writing every time Annie leaned closer to a page. Marcia noticed the shift and hated it. "This is becoming theater," she said. "We are letting a girl from the lobby make subjective calls on executive documents." Annie kept her eyes on the papers. She had learned that some insults lost strength if you did not turn your head for them. Robert did turn. "She's not making the call. I am. And you're basing it on what she says." "I'm basing it on what I see after she points out where to look." "There is a difference?" Marcia asked. "Yes," Robert said. "A large one." Jonathan had been standing near the window, reading a packet David handed him. He spoke without looking up. "Marcia, if your department had looked this closely before the packets reached me, she wouldn't be here." That ended the room again. Annie wanted to feel satisfaction, but instead she felt a nervous pull in her stomach. Every new false signature made the morning less like a mistake and more like a door opening onto something planned. Eric suddenly stopped typing. "I found a routing pattern." Robert moved toward him. "Show me." Eric turned the laptop slightly. The 7 packets came from different department queues. But before HR final review, each one passed through operations administration. David's pen stopped. Calvin's division, more specifically, Eric said, through a shared admin account assigned to the 17th floor. Marcia said too quickly, "Shared accounts are common for routing. That doesn't implicate Mr. Pierce." "No one said it did," Patricia replied, but everyone in the room understood that Calvin Pierce's name had just moved closer to the center. Jonathan's face gave away little, but Annie saw his hand close once around the folder he held. "Names attached to the appointments?" David read from his notes. "1 candidate for deputy finance manager. 1 for vendor compliance. 1 for data security access. 2 HR strategic placement roles. 1 procurement review. 1 executive scheduling liaison." Robert exhaled through his nose. "That's not random." Annie looked up. "Why those jobs?" Robert glanced at Jonathan before answering. "Because if you control money, vendors, data, hiring, and schedules, you don't need to own the company. You can steer it." The room went quiet. Annie thought of Marcia laughing at her empty resume. No degree, no internship, no experience. All that noise about qualifications. While someone else was sliding people into powerful seats with a stolen name, the unfairness of it made her voice come before she planned it. "So, rules matter when they keep people like me out," she said, "but not when they let someone else sneak in." No one answered immediately. Jonathan looked at her then, and something in his face shifted. It was not pity. She would have hated pity. It looked more like recognition, though of what? Annie did not know. Patricia closed one folder. "We need to preserve everything. If this expands, outside counsel should be notified." Jonathan nodded. "Do it discreetly." Marcia stepped away from the door. "Mr. Reed, before this goes any further, I strongly recommend you speak with Calvin. He deserves the chance to clarify." Jonathan looked at her. "Clarify what?" "That his department followed procedure." "Procedure is what I'm looking at. He is Chief Operations Officer, and I am the signature on those papers." Marcia had no answer for that. A knock came at the glass door. Claire from HR stood outside, pale, holding another folder. Marcia opened the door before anyone else could. "What is it?" Claire looked past her to Jonathan. "I'm sorry, Mr. Reed." This was in the pending cart downstairs. It was scheduled to go up with the others. Marcia reached for it. Claire hesitated. Jonathan noticed. "Give it to Mr. Haynes." Claire did. Robert opened the folder, read the first page, then looked at Eric. "Check this packet against the list." Eric typed. His face changed. "It's not one of the 7. Annie felt the room tighten. Robert placed the signature page in front of her. "Don't rush." She looked. The last stroke was straight, careful, stiff. Annie closed her eyes for half a second, then opened them. "It's the same hand," she said. Robert marked it with a red tab. 8. Jonathan turned to David. "I want every pending appointment in the building located and secured within the hour." David was already moving. Jonathan looked at Marcia. "Your department will provide full access." Marcia's voice was low. "Of course," but Annie heard what sat beneath the words. Fear. Not guilt, maybe. Not yet. But fear that something she had helped dismiss had become too large to push out the door. Robert gathered the red-tabbed pages into a separate folder and wrote on the cover in block letters, "Questioned signatures." Then he looked at Annie. "You were right to stop at that table." Annie did not know what to say. Compliments could be harder to carry than insults when you were not used to them. She only nodded. Jonathan checked his watch. "Miss Brooks, we'll need you here a while longer. Can you call someone? Your mother, perhaps?" At the word mother, Annie's throat tightened. Grace would be worried. Worse, Grace would hear Reed Global and worry in the old way. The way people worry when a place has hurt them once and found their child years later. "I can call her," Annie said. "Use my office line," David offered. "No," Annie said quickly, then softened it. "Thank you. I'll use my phone." She stepped into the hallway, just outside the audit room, where the carpet swallowed sound and the windows looked down on a city that seemed smaller from up here. Grace answered on the third ring, her voice tired. "Annie? Hey, Mama. You done with the interview?" Annie looked back through the glass at the files, the people. Jonathan Reed standing at the table with his sleeves now slightly rolled. "Not exactly." Grace was quiet. "What happened?" Annie pressed her hand around the phone. "I found something wrong," she said. At Reed, the silence on the line changed. When Grace spoke again, her voice was lower. "Annie, what kind of wrong?" Annie looked at the closed folders and the red tabs. "The kind you always told me to notice." Grace did not answer right away. Annie stood in the hallway outside the audit room, with the phone pressed to her ear, watching people move behind the glass. Robert Haynes was marking pages with red tabs. David Ellis was on another call, one hand on his hip, his face tight. Jonathan Reed stood at the end of the table, reading the same folder twice, the way a man reads when the words have become personal. On the other end of the line, Annie could hear her mother breathing. "Mama, what did you find?" Grace asked. "A signature. Mr. Reed's signature." It looked wrong. The silence deepened. Annie lowered her voice. "I compared it with your letter." "My letter?" "Yes, ma'am. The one you told me to bring." Grace gave a small sound, not quite a sigh. "Annie, tell me exactly what happened." So Annie told her. Not all of it. Not every insult. Not Marcia throwing the folder or the applicants laughing. She knew Grace would hear what had been done to her even if Annie left out the sharpest parts. She told her about the appointment packets, the same stiff ending on the signatures, the audit room, the red tabs, and Jonathan Reed coming down himself. When Annie finished, Grace said nothing for several seconds. Then she asked, "Did anyone mention Calvin Pierce?" Annie's hand tightened around the phone. "Yes." Grace exhaled slowly. "Lord help us. You know him?" "I knew of him." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I can give you while you're standing in that building." Annie turned slightly away from the glass. "Mama, what happened when you worked here?" Grace's voice changed. It grew careful, like she was choosing each word from a drawer full of broken glass. "I worked in records. That's what happened." "No, more than that. Annie, you always said the letter proved you mattered there. Today, somebody upstairs remembered you. David Ellis said you flagged something before a court case. He remembered that?" "Yes." Grace was quiet again. Annie could imagine her sitting at the small kitchen table, still in the faded cardigan she wore after night shifts. one hand on her forehead, bills spread near the salt shaker. "I did my job," Grace said at last. "That was all. Then why did you leave?" A door opened down the hall, and two employees stepped out, speaking quickly. Annie turned her back to them. Grace said, "Because sometimes doing your job makes the wrong people uncomfortable." Before Annie could ask more, Robert opened the audit room door and leaned out. "Miss Brooks?" Annie covered the phone. "Yes, sir? Mr. Reed would like to speak with you when you're done." Grace heard the name through the line. "Is that Robert Haynes?" Annie blinked. "You know him too?" "I know his voice. He was in internal audit back then." Robert's face changed when Annie looked at him. "Mama says she knows your voice," Annie said. Robert went still. "Who's your mother?" "Grace Brooks." For the first time since Annie had met him, Robert's hard, practical face softened. "Tell her Robert Haynes says hello," he said. Then, after a pause, "Tell her I'm sorry I didn't ask more questions back then." Annie repeated it into the phone. Grace did not speak. "Mama? I heard you," Grace said quietly. Robert stepped back into the audit room, leaving Annie alone again. "What does he mean?" Annie asked. Grace's answer was tired. "It means I wasn't crazy." The words settled into Annie like a weight. All her life, Grace had spoken of Reed Global in fragments. A good job, a bad ending. People who smiled while closing doors. A letter kept under the bed like a witness. Annie had thought her mother's pain belonged to the past, something old and private, something poverty had deepened but not caused. Now that pain had a name, a floor number, and a set of appointment packets with Jonathan Reed's signature bent into a lie. "Come home," Grace said. Annie looked through the glass. Jonathan had lifted his head and was watching her now, not impatiently, but with the focus of a man waiting for an answer he knew he had not earned. "I don't think I can yet." "You can. You walk to the elevator, you go downstairs, and you come home." "Mama, if this is connected to what happened to you, that is exactly why you should come home." Annie closed her eyes. "If you saw something wrong back then and no one listened, maybe they'll listen now." Grace's voice sharpened. "Annie, people like that do not just listen because the truth gets older. Mr. Reed listened today. Mr. Reed built the building. That doesn't mean he knows what happens in the basement." Annie looked down at her shoes. "I know. Baby, I'm not saying you did wrong. I'm saying powerful people protect powerful people. And when they get scared, they look for somebody small enough to blame. I'm already small to them." "No," Grace said. "You are my child. That is not small." Annie swallowed hard. Behind the glass, Jonathan said something to David, then left the audit room and walked toward the hallway. Annie straightened without meaning to. He stopped a few feet away, giving her space. "Miss Brooks," he said quietly. "Is your mother on the phone?" Annie nodded. "May I speak with her?" Grace heard him. "No." Annie almost smiled despite everything. She said, "No, sir." Jonathan accepted that with a nod. "Fair enough. Ask her if she would be willing to meet with me another time." Annie repeated the question. Grace's answer came fast. "No." She said no again. This time Jonathan's mouth tightened, not in anger. In recognition. "I understand," he said. "Tell her I remember the Anderson file. Tell her I remember the letter. And tell her I should have remembered more." Annie repeated the words. Grace did not respond right away. When she did, her voice had lost its sharpness, but not its guard. "Ask him if he remembers the second report." Annie looked at Jonathan. "She wants to know if you remember the second report." Jonathan's face changed. "What second report?" he asked. Annie heard Grace breathe out through the phone, almost like she had expected that answer and dreaded it at the same time. "She says you don't remember." Jonathan looked down the hall, then back at Annie. "No, I don't." Grace spoke again. "Then tell him to look in archived personnel disputes, not legal records. They buried it under conduct review." Annie repeated it word for word. Jonathan turned immediately. David appeared at the doorway. "Archived personnel disputes," Jonathan said. "Grace Brooks, conduct review, pull everything." David did not ask why. "On it." Grace heard the movement. "Annie, listen to me." "Yes, ma'am." "You do not sign anything. You do not agree to anything. You do not let them put you in a room alone with anyone from HR. If Robert Haynes is there, you stay near him. If that man Calvin Pierce appears, you walk away." Annie's skin went cold. "Mama, promise me." "I promise." "And Annie?" "Yes?" Grace's voice trembled now, just enough to show the hurt beneath the discipline. Do not let them make you feel grateful for being believed late. Annie looked at Jonathan, who stood close enough to hear the last part but did not pretend he hadn't. I won't, Annie said. When the call ended, Annie held the phone for a moment longer before putting it away. Jonathan was silent. She doesn't trust this company, Annie said. She shouldn't, he replied. That answer surprised her. He looked toward the audit room. Your mother filed a second report? I don't know. She never told me. I never saw it. Annie met his eyes. Maybe somebody made sure of that. Jonathan did not defend himself. He did not say impossible. He did not say procedures would have prevented it. The morning had taken those words away from him. David returned faster than Annie expected, carrying no paper yet, only his tablet and a troubled look. There's a record, he said. Grace Brooks filed an internal concern 12 years ago. It was reclassified 3 days later as a conduct issue. Robert came to the doorway behind him. Who reclassified it? David looked at Jonathan, then at Annie. Operations liaison at the time, he said. Calvin Pierce. The hallway seemed to narrow. Annie thought of Grace saying, people like that do not just listen because the truth gets older. She thought of the letter under the bed, protected for years because it was the last clean thing her mother had from this place. Jonathan's voice was calm, but something hard had entered it. Pull the file. David hesitated. It's marked restricted. By whom? David checked the tablet. No one spoke. Finally, David said, Marcia Bell. David's words stayed in the hallway like a door that had not fully closed. Marcia Bell. Annie looked through the glass wall of the audit room. Marcia stood inside near the far end of the table, speaking quietly to Patricia from legal. Her posture was straight, her face composed, but her hand rested too tightly on the back of a chair. Jonathan did not move for several seconds. Who has access to restricted personnel disputes? He asked. David checked the tablet again. HR executive admin, general counsel, the assigned reviewer, and the CEO's office. Was my office notified? David scrolled, then shook his head. No record of notification. Robert Haynes stepped closer, his expression grim. That means it was buried before it reached anyone who could act on it. Annie's mouth felt dry. My mother told the truth, and they turned it into a conduct problem. No one corrected her. Jonathan looked at David. Get the file. It will trigger an access alert. Good, Jonathan said. Let whoever buried it know we're digging. David nodded and walked back toward the audit room. Annie stayed in the hallway, trying to steady her breathing. The building no longer felt impressive. It felt layered, full of sealed rooms and polite words hiding ugly things. She thought of Grace coming home years ago, taking off her work shoes, rubbing her ankles, telling Annie she had left the company because it was time. Not because she had been pushed, not because someone had made her name dirty in a file. Jonathan turned to her. Miss Brooks, I'm sorry. Annie looked at him. For what? For not knowing. That's not the same as not doing it. No, he said. It isn't. The answer was honest enough that Annie did not know what to do with it. Before either of them spoke again, the elevator at the end of the corridor opened. A man stepped out with a phone in one hand and a leather folder under his arm. He was broad-shouldered, well-dressed, with silver hair combed back and a smile that seemed made for boardrooms. He walked fast until he saw Jonathan. Then he slowed, as if the hallway had become a stage, and he needed to choose the right entrance. Jonathan, he said, I heard there was some confusion with the appointment packets. Annie knew before anyone introduced him. Calvin Pierce. Jonathan's face closed. Who called you? Calvin lifted his eyebrows. I run operations. When executive appointments freeze without notice, people tend to ask questions. No one was supposed to notify operations. Then someone must have been worried. Calvin's gaze moved to Annie. It paused on her blazer, her folder, then her face. And this is? Annie did not answer. Jonathan did. Annie Brooks. Calvin's expression barely changed, but something sharpened behind his eyes. Brooks? Yes, Jonathan said. Calvin smiled. Small world. Robert stepped into the hallway behind Annie, quiet but present. Annie remembered her mother's warning. If Calvin Pierce appears, you walk away. She took half a step back. Calvin noticed. Don't be nervous, he said to Annie. I don't bite. Robert spoke before she could. Good. Because this isn't the place for teeth. Calvin's smile thinned. Robert, still turning paper into drama? Still watching men call evidence drama when it points in their direction? Jonathan raised a hand, not to protect Calvin, but to stop the exchange from scattering the moment. Calvin, your division routed appointment packets bearing my signature. I don't remember signing them. Calvin gave a careful nod. That's concerning, of course. But signatures pass through several administrative layers. We should be careful before implying misconduct. Nomer 7. We are being careful. By letting a rejected applicant sit in an audit room, Annie felt the hit, but she did not lower her eyes. Jonathan's voice turned cold. By examining documents before alerting the department tied to them. Calvin looked at him for a long second. You think I'm tied to forged signatures? I think your name keeps appearing where it should not. That's not an answer. It's the one you've earned so far. The hallway went still. Calvin glanced toward the audit room. Marcia had come to the glass door but had not opened it. Their eyes met for less than a second. It was quick, but Annie saw it. A warning passed between them, or maybe fear. Calvin turned back to Annie. So you're Grace's daughter. This time Annie answered, yes. She was a records clerk, wasn't she? She worked in records. That's what I said. No, Annie said. You made it smaller. Robert's mouth twitched, but he said nothing. Calvin's smile returned, softer and more dangerous. You have your mother's spirit. I remember that. She had a habit of seeing conspiracy in routine paperwork. Annie's voice stayed low, maybe because the paperwork wasn't routine. Jonathan looked at Calvin. Grace filed a second report 12 years ago. It was reclassified as a conduct issue by your office. Calvin did not blink. I'd have to see the file. You will, with legal present. Good, because memory becomes unreliable after 12 years. My signature became unreliable this morning, Jonathan said. Let's not blame memory too soon. David came out of the audit room holding a printed access log. His face told Annie the file was worse than expected. We have a problem, he said. Jonathan turned. Only one? The restricted file exists, but several attachments are missing from the digital archive. The index shows 5 supporting documents. Only 2 remain. Robert cursed under his breath. Patricia appeared behind David. Deletion? Eric from IT stepped into view. Not deleted. Removed before digitization, probably when old paper files were scanned. The digital record was created incomplete. Jonathan looked at Calvin. Your liaison reclassified it, and now the support documents are missing. Calvin's tone stayed smooth. Jonathan, if we're going to turn every clerical issue from 12 years ago into an accusation, we'll be here all week. Annie thought of her mother's box under the bed. The old letter. The way Grace kept receipts for years because she trusted paper more than people. My mother kept copies, Annie said. Every head turned. Calvin's smile faded by a fraction. Jonathan looked at her. Are you sure? No, Annie said. But she keeps everything that ever mattered. If she filed a report and thought someone might bury it, she would have kept something. Robert nodded slowly. That sounds like Grace. Calvin gave a light laugh. So now the company's investigation depends on a box under someone's bed? Annie looked at him. Better than depending on a file your people touched. The words left her before fear could stop them. Calvin stepped closer. Not enough to threaten openly. Only enough to remind her of the difference between his place and hers. You're very bold for someone who came here asking for a favor. I came asking for work. And now you're accusing executives. I'm answering questions. Careful, Calvin said softly. Smart girls know when a room is too big for them. Annie's skin went cold, but she held his eyes. My mother cleaned rooms bigger than this. Size doesn't scare me. Jonathan moved then, placing himself slightly between Calvin and Annie. That's enough. Calvin looked at Jonathan's shoulder, then at his face. The mask returned. Of course. I only meant we should protect her from getting involved in something she doesn't understand. Robert said. Funny. She understood the signature. David's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen, then at Jonathan. Sir. Facilities says someone from operations requested access to old personnel storage 10 minutes ago. Calvin turned. Operations manages storage access all the time. Not today, Jonathan said. Lock it down. David was already typing. On it. Annie looked at Calvin's face and finally saw what had been hiding beneath the smooth voice. He was not annoyed. He was afraid. Jonathan faced him. You will return to your office. You will not contact HR, operations administration, records, facilities, or any pending appointment candidate until legal speaks with you. Calvin's jaw tightened. That sounds like a suspension. It's an instruction. And if I object? Jonathan held his gaze. Then I'll make it a suspension. For a moment, Calvin said nothing. Then he adjusted his cuffs and gave a small nod. As you wish. He walked toward the elevator. As he passed Annie, he lowered his voice just enough that only she could hear. Tell your mother old paper burns easily. The elevator doors closed behind him. Annie stood frozen. Jonathan saw her face. What did he say? Annie forced the words out. He said old paper burns easily. Robert's expression changed at once. Call Grace. Annie was already reaching for her phone. Her hand shook this time. She dialed once, twice, and listened as it rang. No answer. She called again. Still no answer. Jonathan turned to David. Get my car downstairs. Annie looked up. We're going to your mother's apartment. Robert grabbed his coat from the chair. I'm coming. Jonathan did not argue. Annie tried calling Grace a third time as they moved toward the elevator. Each unanswered ring sounded louder than the last. For the first time that day, the danger had left the paper and started moving toward home. The elevator ride down felt longer than it should have. Annie stood between Jonathan and Robert, phone pressed in both hands, staring at the screen as if her mother's name might appear if she looked hard enough. It did not. The call log showed Grace Brooks 3 times, each one unanswered. Jonathan said nothing. Robert said nothing. Even David, who had joined them only to hand Jonathan a set of keys and a note with the driver's location, kept his voice low. When the elevator opened into the lobby, people turned. They saw Jonathan Reed walking fast with a young woman in a worn blazer and an older auditor close behind him. Marcia was nowhere in sight. The appointment packets were gone from the table, but the room still seemed to remember what had happened there. Mr. Collins looked up from the security desk. Miss Brooks? Annie tried to answer, but her throat tightened. Jonathan spoke. We're going to her mother's apartment. If anyone asks where I am, David knows what to say. Mr. Collins nodded, then looked at Annie. You call me if you need anything, young lady. That almost undid her. Yes, sir. Outside, the cold hit hard. A black company car waited at the curb. Annie gave the address with a voice that sounded smaller than she wanted it to. South Side, a brick apartment building near a laundromat and a church with a red door. The driver pulled into traffic. Chicago slid past the windows, office towers giving way to older buildings, then small storefronts with hand-painted signs, beauty shops, corner stores, churches with bulletin boards announcing food drives and Sunday breakfasts. Annie knew every mile of the change. It was the route between people who were believed and people who had to prove they deserved to be. She called again. No answer. Robert sat beside her, looking out the window. Your mother ever keep her phone on silent? When she sleeps after a night shift, Annie said. But she knew I was at Reed. She would have kept it close. Jonathan leaned forward. Does she live alone? With me. Anyone else have a key? Our neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez. In case Mama's sugar drops or she needs help. Call her. Annie did. Mrs. Alvarez answered on the second ring, breathless, with a television murmuring in the background. Annie? Mija, you okay? Mrs. Alvarez, can you check on my mother? She's not answering. What happened? Please, just knock. There was movement, a door opening, the sound of hallway noise. Annie held the phone tight as Mrs. Alvarez walked down the hall. A knock came through the speaker. Grace? Grace? Honey, it's me. Another knock. Then Annie heard Mrs. Alvarez say, Aye, the door is open. Annie sat forward. Open? Jonathan looked at the driver. Faster, please. The driver changed lanes. Mrs. Alvarez's voice came back, lower now. Annie, I'm going inside. Stay on the phone. I am. There were footsteps. A pause. Then Mrs. Alvarez gasped. Annie's stomach dropped. What? What is it? Your mother is here. She's sitting on the kitchen floor. Mama? She's awake. Grace. Baby. Look at me. Annie's on the phone. A rustle. Then Grace's voice, weak but clear enough to break Annie's heart. Annie? Mama, what happened? I'm all right. No, you're not. What happened? Grace coughed. Someone came to the door, said they were from building maintenance. I didn't open it wide. They pushed in. Jonathan's face hardened. Robert took out his phone and began dialing someone. Grace continued, her voice strained. They didn't hit me, just knocked me back. They went to the bedroom. The box, Annie whispered. I tried to stop them. Mama, they took some papers, Grace said. Not all. Annie closed her eyes. Are you hurt? My wrist, maybe my shoulder. Mrs. Alvarez is here. Jonathan leaned toward Annie. Tell her not to touch anything else. Police need to see the room. Annie repeated it. Grace heard Jonathan's voice in the background. Is he with you? Yes. A pause. Don't let him come in acting like he owns my grief, Grace said. Annie almost laughed and cried at the same time. Yes, ma'am. When they reached the building, Jonathan was out first, but he did not rush ahead of Annie. That mattered. He followed her lead up the cracked front steps, through the worn lobby, and up to the second floor where the hallway smelled of detergent, old paint, and somebody's fried onions from lunch. Mrs. Alvarez stood in the doorway, a small woman with gray hair pulled back and worry all over her face. She's in the kitchen. Annie went past her. Grace sat on a chair now, one arm held close to her body. Her cardigan hung loose at one shoulder. A bruise was already darkening near her wrist, but her eyes were clear, and when she saw Annie, she tried to stand. No, Annie said, crossing the room. Don't. Grace touched her daughter's cheek with her good hand. I'm all right. You keep saying that like it makes it true. It makes me feel better. It doesn't make me feel better. Grace managed a tired smile. Then I'll stop. Jonathan stayed near the doorway. Robert moved carefully toward the bedroom but did not enter. Mrs. Brooks, Jonathan said. I'm sorry. Grace looked at him. That word is getting a lot of exercise today. He accepted the blow. Yes, ma'am. Annie looked toward the bedroom. The mattress had been pulled halfway off the frame. A drawer lay open. Clothes were scattered. Not wildly, but with purpose. Someone had known where to look. Grace followed her gaze. They found the box. Annie's chest tightened. But they were in a hurry, Grace said, and they didn't know me well enough. She nodded toward the kitchen cabinet under the sink. Annie frowned. Mama? The box under the bed had copies. The real folder is behind the loose panel under the pipes. Robert turned slowly from the bedroom door. Grace Brooks. You beautiful, stubborn woman. Grace looked at him for the first time. Robert Haynes. Yes, ma'am. You got old. So did you. I got tired, Grace said. There's a difference. Robert's face softened. I know. Jonathan did not move until Grace looked at him and said, Well, if you came all this way, you might as well see what your company buried. Annie opened the cabinet under the sink. Behind cleaning supplies and a stack of folded grocery bags was a loose wooden panel. She pulled it free. Inside, wrapped in a plastic freezer bag, was a thick folder bound with a rubber band. She placed it on the kitchen table. Grace put her good hand on top of it before anyone could open it. These are not souvenirs, she said. These are the years I was called difficult, unstable, uncooperative. Every page in here cost me something. Jonathan came closer, slow enough not to crowd her. I understand. Grace's eyes lifted. No, Mr. Reed, you don't, but you can start. She removed her hand. Robert opened the folder first. There were copies of internal memos, handwritten notes, routing slips, names, dates, and a report titled Personnel Placement Irregularities. Calvin Pierce appeared more than once. So did Marcia Bell, though back then she had been listed as HR compliance manager. Annie stood beside her mother, reading what she could. Some of the language was cold and corporate, but the meaning was not. Grace had warned them. She had named patterns. She had asked for review. Then her concern had been turned into a complaint against her conduct. Jonathan picked up one memo and went still. What? Annie asked. He read aloud, quietly. Employee appears fixated on unsupported theories and may be creating unnecessary racial tension within interdepartmental review. Grace gave a small, bitter laugh. That was their favorite line. If I noticed something wrong, I was creating tension. If I stayed quiet, I was professional. Jonathan's face changed in a way Annie had not seen before. Shame was part of it, but not all. There was anger too, and this time it was not for himself. I signed off on the restructuring that year, he said. Grace looked at him. Yes. I didn't see this. No. I should have. Yes. No one tried to soften it. Mrs. Alvarez brought a glass of water to Grace and muttered, "People in suits always lose papers when the papers tell the truth." Robert looked through another stack. "These copies are enough to reopen the original complaint." Jonathan said, "Not just reopen it, expand it." Grace looked at him. "Careful, Mr. Reed. Expanding things is how companies make victims disappear inside procedures." Jonathan met her eyes. "Then you tell us how not to." Grace did not answer quickly. She looked at Annie first, then at the bruise on her own wrist, then at the folder that had survived, because she had trusted a kitchen cabinet more than a corporation. "You don't move this through HR," Grace said. "You don't let operations see what we have. You don't call Calvin Pierce into a polite meeting where he gets time to clean his tracks. And you don't use my daughter as a shield because she saw what your people missed." Jonathan nodded once. "Agreed." Annie looked at her mother. "Mama, why didn't you ever tell me?" Grace touched the edge of the folder. "Because I didn't want you growing up thinking telling the truth only gets you punished. But you taught me to notice things." Grace smiled sadly. "I was hoping you'd use it somewhere kinder." A knock sounded at the apartment door. Everyone froze. Mrs. Alvarez crossed herself. Robert moved toward the door and looked through the peephole. Police. Jonathan had called them from the car. Annie realized. Grace closed her eyes. "Good." Annie sat beside her and took her uninjured hand. Jonathan gathered the papers carefully but did not remove them from the table. Not yet. For once, Reed Global's billionaire founder stood in a small kitchen and waited for permission from the woman his company had failed. Grace looked at him and said, "If this goes forward, it goes forward with my name clean." Jonathan answered without hesitation, "It will." Grace held his gaze. "And my daughter?" Jonathan looked at Annie. "She will not be punished for seeing the truth." Grace's grip tightened around Annie's hand. Outside, the police knocked again, firmer this time. The old folder lay open between them. And Annie understood that the story had changed. The false signature was no longer just a warning about what Calvin Pierce was doing now. It was proof that the past had never ended. It had only been waiting for someone to look closely enough. The police took Grace's statement at the kitchen table while Annie sat close enough for their knees to touch. Jonathan stood near the sink, quiet, his coat still buttoned, as if taking it off would make him look too comfortable in a room where he had not earned comfort. Robert stayed by the doorway with the old folder in his hands, watching every page as though it might be snatched again if he looked away. One officer, a woman in her 50s named Morales, asked Grace to describe the men who came in. Grace gave what she could. 2 men, work jackets, one taller, one stockier, baseball caps. The taller one had a small scar near his chin. They said they were checking a leak. When Grace did not open the door wide enough, one pushed through. "They knew where to go?" Officer Morales asked. Grace nodded. "Straight to the bedroom." "Anything else missing?" "Only papers." The younger officer glanced at Jonathan. "No jewelry? Cash? Electronics?" Grace looked at him. "Officer, I clean offices at night. If I had jewelry worth stealing, I wouldn't keep it in a shoebox under the bed." The officer had the decency to look embarrassed. "Yes, ma'am." Jonathan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Annie noticed that. Earlier that day, she might have expected a man like him to step in and explain things. Now he seemed to understand that this was Grace's room, Grace's story, Grace's right to answer. When the police left with photos, notes, and a promise to follow up, the apartment felt smaller. Mrs. Alvarez made coffee no one had asked for and set mugs on the table anyway. "People need something warm when the world acts ugly," she said. Grace accepted hers with her good hand. Robert placed the folder back on the table. "We need copies made tonight." Grace shook her head. "Not at Reed." "No," Jonathan said. "Not at Reed." Everyone looked at him. He continued. "Outside counsel. Independent copy service. Chain of custody. Robert can supervise. Officer Morales gave us a report number. We attached that to every duplicate." Grace studied him. "You learned that fast." "I'm learning late," Jonathan said. "There's a difference." That answer did not soften Grace, but it kept her listening. Annie touched the edge of the folder. "Mama, if those papers prove what happened, Why did they only take the copies under the bed? Because men like that think poor women hide everything in the obvious place, Grace said. Under mattresses, in shoeboxes, in kitchen drawers. They don't think we plan. They think we only survive. Mrs. Alvarez made a sound of agreement from the stove. That's why they lose. Robert gave a dry nod. Let's hope. Jonathan looked at Annie. Your mother needs medical attention. I'm fine, Grace said at once. Annie turned to her. No, ma'am. Grace lifted one eyebrow. Don't start mothering me. You started bleeding through your sleeve. Grace glanced down. A thin red mark had appeared near her wrist where the skin had split. Jonathan reached for his phone. I can have a doctor come. Grace's eyes snapped to him. I don't need a private doctor sent like a gift basket. Annie closed her eyes for 1 second. Mama. No, Grace said. I know how this begins. A car, a doctor, a favor. Then suddenly my pain becomes part of somebody else's redemption. Jonathan put his phone down slowly. Then tell me what is acceptable. Grace looked at him for a long time. Urgent care. Normal place. I pay what I can. If your company is responsible for what happened today, your company can reimburse through a legal claim. Not kindness. Jonathan nodded. Done. Robert picked up the folder. I'll take this to Patricia and outside counsel. Grace's hand came down on it. Annie goes with it. Annie looked at her mother. Mama, you need me. I need you safe, and right now those papers are part of that. Grace turned to Jonathan. She does not go alone. Robert goes. Your lawyer goes. Not HR. Not operations. Not one person whose name is in those files. Jonathan answered, agreed. Annie wanted to argue, but Grace squeezed her hand. Baby, listen to me. The first time I reported Calvin Pierce, I believed the system would protect the truth because the truth was documented. I was wrong. This time the truth doesn't travel without witnesses. That settled it. By early evening, Annie was in the back of Jonathan's company car with Robert beside her, and the folder in a sealed evidence envelope on his lap. Patricia Sloan met them at a small legal office downtown, not Reed Global's usual firm, but an independent counsel Jonathan had called from the apartment hallway. The copy room smelled of warm toner and old carpet. Annie watched every page go through the scanner. Grace's handwritten notes, routing slips, names, dates, the old report titled Personnel Placement Irregularities, a memo that accused Grace of creating unnecessary racial tension, a complaint form signed by Marcia Bell, a transfer approval bearing Calvin Pierce's initials. Robert kept a log by hand. Patricia labeled each copy. Annie sat with her mother's letter in her lap, still in its plastic sleeve. She had carried it so long that day it felt less like paper and more like a pulse. Patricia glanced at her. You holding up? Annie almost said yes, the way people expected. Instead, she remembered what Grace had told her about not being grateful for late belief. No, Annie said, but I'm still here. Patricia accepted that. Fair answer. When the last copy was made, Robert sealed one set for outside counsel, one for legal, and one for Grace. He looked at Annie before sealing the final envelope. Your mother saved this company once, he said, maybe twice. Annie shook her head. No. She tried to save it. The company didn't want saving. Robert had no quick answer. That made her respect him more. It was nearly dark when they returned to Reed Global. Annie had expected the building to look different after everything, but it still rose above the street in clean glass and steel, glowing like nothing inside it could rot. That made her angrier than she expected. Jonathan was waiting in the audit room when they arrived. His tie was loosened. His sleeves were rolled. On the table were more appointment packets, access logs, and printed charts. David sat with a laptop open. Eric from IT had dark circles under his eyes. Marcia was not there. Annie noticed immediately. Where's Miss Bell? She asked. Jonathan looked at David. David answered, placed on restricted access pending review. Does she know why? She knows enough to be nervous. Robert set the sealed envelopes on the table. Grace's documents are copied, logged, and preserved. Outside counsel has a set. Jonathan nodded. Good. Annie stood near the door, unsure whether she belonged in the room now that the emergency had moved beyond her first observation. Jonathan saw it. Miss Brooks, he said, if you are willing, we still need your help comparing physical signatures. Only that. Nothing beyond what Mr. Haynes approves. She looked at the table. You still want me here? Yes. Even after what happened to my mother? Especially after what happened to your mother. But only if you choose it. That mattered. Choose. Not be used. Not be displayed. Choose. Annie thought of Grace sitting at urgent care with Mrs. Alvarez, refusing private treatment but accepting a receipt for reimbursement. She thought of the men who had come into their home and gone straight for the bedroom. She thought of Calvin's voice in the hallway. Old paper burns easily. I'll help, Annie said, but I want something understood. Jonathan waited. I came here for a job. I still want one, but not because I need your pity. I want to be inside the room where people like my mother were pushed out. The room went quiet. Robert looked down at his notes, but Annie could tell he had heard every word. Jonathan met her eyes. Then we will be careful about how you enter that room. Annie nodded. Good, because I don't want a favor wearing a badge. For the first time that day, Jonathan almost smiled. Not with amusement, with respect. Neither do I, he said. They worked for another hour. Annie compared signatures until the lines blurred. Robert made her take breaks, drink water, and eat a sandwich David brought from the cafeteria. Turkey on wheat, mustard on the side. It was the kind of small, practical care that did not ask to be praised. By 9 o'clock, they had identified 12 questionable signatures across 18 months. The pattern was no longer hidden. Finance, vendor compliance, data security, HR strategy, executive scheduling. Each placement looked harmless alone. Together, they formed a map. Robert drew circles around the departments on a whiteboard and connected them with a black marker. If someone controlled these seats, he said, they could see money, move people, access data, steer vendors, and shape what reaches Jonathan's desk. David stared at the board. That's not favoritism. No, Patricia said. That's infrastructure. Jonathan stood in front of the board, arms folded. The company he had built was appearing before him as something else, something invaded through paperwork and trust. Annie looked at the circles. He wasn't just getting people hired. Robert capped the marker. No, he was building a company inside the company. Jonathan's eyes stayed on the board. Yes, he said, and he used my name as the key. A soft knock came at the door. Claire from HR stood outside again, holding a folder close to her chest. She looked frightened. Jonathan opened the door himself. Claire? She glanced behind her before stepping in. I found something in the pending cart. It wasn't with the others because Miss Bell marked it for tomorrow. Robert reached for it. Another appointment? Claire nodded. Data security access. Temporary at first, but it converts automatically after 30 days. David opened the folder and read the candidate name. His face changed. What? Jonathan asked. David looked up. The candidate is Calvin Pierce's nephew. The room tightened. Eric pulled the digital record. This one is scheduled for automatic activation Friday at 5. Robert looked at the clock on the wall. That's tomorrow. Annie felt the day's exhaustion fall away. Jonathan's voice was low. Can he access the audit trail if it activates? Eric typed fast. With this role? Yes. Not everything, but enough to make our lives miserable. Patricia said. We need to suspend it now. Eric frowned. I can flag it, but HR and operations both have release authority. Jonathan turned to David. Not anymore. David began typing instructions into his laptop. Annie looked at the signature page Robert had placed in front of her. She did not need long. It's wrong, she said. Robert asked. Same ending? Same ending. Jonathan's face hardened. Outside the audit room, Reed Global's night staff moved quietly through the corridors. Somewhere in the building, Calvin Pierce still had allies, access, and time. Not much, but enough. Annie looked at the whiteboard again, at the circles and lines, and understood that the next day would not be about whether she belonged in the room. It would be about whether the truth could stay there long enough to matter. By morning, the story had already changed shape inside Reed Global. No official announcement had gone out. No memo had named Calvin Pierce. No one had told employees that 12 questionable signatures had been found, or that Grace Brooks, a former records employee, had kept the documents HR once buried. Still, rumors moved through the building before the first pot of coffee was gone. Annie felt them as soon as she walked through the lobby. Yesterday, People had looked at her like she was a problem at the recruiting table. Today, they looked away too quickly. Some stared, then pretended they had not. Others leaned toward one another after she passed. She wore the same blazer. There had been no time to find anything else. Grace had wanted to press it again that morning, even with her wrist wrapped from urgent care. But Annie stopped her. "Mama, sit down." Grace had looked offended. "This sleeve is wrinkled. My whole life is wrinkled right now. The sleeve can wait." That had made Grace laugh once, softly, before the pain in her shoulder reminded her not to. Now Annie crossed the lobby with Mr. Collins watching from the security desk. He gave her a small nod. "Morning, Miss Brooks." "Morning, Mr. Collins." The word "miss" sounded different today, not like pity, like recognition. David met her near the elevators and handed her a temporary badge. It had her name printed on a white sticker. Annie Brooks, executive office visitor. Under it, in smaller letters, "Escort required." "Not perfect," David said, "but better than yesterday." Annie clipped it to her blazer. "Yesterday I had security walking me out. Low bar then." She almost smiled. The smile faded when they stepped into the elevator and two employees inside stopped talking. One glanced at her badge, then at David. By the time they reached the executive floor, Annie had heard her first whisper of the day. "That's her." David pretended not to hear it. Annie did not have that luxury. In the audit room, Robert was already working with a paper cup of black coffee and a stack of folders. Patricia was on a call with outside counsel. Eric had two monitors open, both filled with access logs. The whiteboard from the night before still showed the circles and lines. Finance, data security, vendor compliance, HR strategy, executive scheduling. Annie looked at it and felt the same cold understanding. Calvin had not been helping relatives get jobs. He had been building control. Robert pushed a breakfast sandwich toward her. "Eat." "I had toast." "That's not breakfast, that's a warning." Annie sat and unwrapped the sandwich. Egg and cheese, still warm. "Thank you." Robert lowered his voice. "Your mother?" "Sore, angry, which means she's herself." "Good." Jonathan entered a few minutes later. He looked as if he had slept in a chair, though his suit was clean and his face composed. He greeted everyone by name, including Annie. That small act did not go unnoticed by the room. "Where are we?" he asked. Eric turned from his monitor. "The Pierce nephew file is still scheduled to activate today at 5. I placed a security flag, but the system requires a second executive override to fully suspend it." Jonathan frowned. "Why?" "Because the role is classified as temporary emergency coverage. HR and operations built the workflow. If both departments approve, it bypasses standard delay." Patricia ended her call. "That should never have been allowed for data security." Robert said, "Unless someone wanted it allowed." Jonathan looked at David. "Can I override it manually?" "Yes, but it triggers board notification." "Then notify them." Patricia lifted a hand. "Before we do that, the board needs context. If they hear CEO freezes data appointment tied to COO's relative, without preparation, Calvin will frame it as instability." Annie listened, chewing slowly, trying to follow the power language. Board notification, manual override, instability. These were polished words for a simple danger. If Jonathan moved too fast, Calvin would accuse him of panic. If he moved too slow, Calvin's nephew might gain access. David's phone buzzed. He read the message, and his face tightened. "What?" Jonathan asked. "Calvin requested an emergency board agenda item for this afternoon." Robert muttered. "Of course he did." Patricia asked. "Subject?" David read from the screen. "Executive process disruption and unauthorized involvement of outside individuals in confidential personnel matters." Everyone knew what that meant. Annie, the sandwich turned heavy in her stomach. Jonathan's eyes moved to her, then back to David. "Who accepted the agenda item?" "Board secretary. It's set for 3. Robert leaned back. "He's trying to make her the issue before the documents become the issue." Patricia nodded. "And if he succeeds, every finding she touched becomes easier to challenge." Annie put the sandwich down. "Then I should leave." "No," Robert said at once. "If I'm the thing he's using, you're the witness," Patricia said. "That is why he's using you." Jonathan came to the table. Miss Brooks, leaving will not protect you. It will only let him write the story without you in the room. Annie looked at him. People like him always get rooms. Yes, Jonathan said. That changes today. She wanted to believe that. She also knew belief had never paid rent, never kept Grace from scrubbing floors after midnight, never stopped men from pushing into their apartment for old paper. My mother lost work yesterday, Annie said. Did anyone tell you that? Jonathan's face hardened. No. Her cleaning company called after Calvin talked to me. They said her night shift might be cut. David began taking notes. Annie continued. Then someone broke into our apartment. So when people in this building say process, I hear price. Because that's what it costs us. Every time somebody powerful feels threatened. The room went quiet. Robert looked down at his coffee. Jonathan did not look away. You're right. Annie did not expect that answer. He continued. And I won't insult you by pretending I can undo that with one decision. But I can make sure the next decision does not leave you standing alone. Before Annie could respond, the audit room door opened. Marcia Bell stood there. Her badge still worked, but her face showed she knew it might not for long. She wore a dark suit today, more severe than yesterday's cream one. Her eyes went directly to Annie's temporary badge. How nice, Marcia said. The visitor has become part of the department. Jonathan turned. You are not assigned to this room. I came to deliver requested HR materials. David stood. You can leave them with me. Marcia ignored him and placed a folder on the table. I also wanted to correct the record before this afternoon's board discussion. There has been a great deal of emotional language around Miss Brooks and her mother. Annie felt Robert shift beside her. Marcia continued. Grace Brooks was not terminated for reporting concerns. She was released after repeated conflicts with supervisors, refusal to follow communication protocols, and accusations that created racial tension in the workplace. Annie stood before she knew she was standing. Robert said quietly, Annie. But Marcia had wanted this. Annie could see it now. She wanted anger. She wanted volume. She wanted the room to see Annie as proof of whatever had been written about Grace. Annie sat back down slowly. Marcia's eyes narrowed. Annie folded her hands on the table, just as Grace did when she refused to give someone the satisfaction of seeing her shake. My mother told the truth, Annie said. If the truth created tension, maybe the room was already sick. Robert's mouth twitched again. Jonathan looked at Marcia. You marked Grace Brooks's second report restricted. Marcia did not blink. Following procedure. Which procedure? The conduct review process. Who recommended reclassification? I would need to review the file. Patricia slid a copied memo across the table. We have it. Marcia looked down. Patricia said, your initials are on the reclassification form. Calvin Pierce's are on the routing note. Grace's supporting documents were removed before digitization. I didn't remove documents. No one said you did, Patricia replied. Yet, Marcia's lips pressed together. Jonathan spoke. You are suspended from all access to personnel archives, appointment workflows, and candidate review systems pending investigation. Marcia's face flushed. You cannot be serious. I am. Because of her? Marcia pointed at Annie now. All polish gone. A girl who couldn't even qualify for a receptionist interview. Jonathan's voice dropped. Because of you. The room froze. Marcia stared at him. Jonathan continued. Because you dismissed a warning 12 years ago. Dismissed another one yesterday. And now you are standing in an audit room trying to turn evidence into an attitude problem. Marcia looked around the table, perhaps expecting someone to help her. No one did. She picked up her folder, but Patricia stopped her. That stays. Marcia let go as if the paper had burned her. At the door, she turned back to Annie. Enjoy the attention while it lasts. Annie met her eyes. I didn't ask for attention. I asked for work. Marcia left. The door closed softly, but the effect stayed. Annie realized her hands were clenched and opened them under the table. Jonathan turned to David. Add witness intimidation and retaliatory conduct to the board packet. David nodded. Patricia looked at the clock. 3 o'clock is coming fast. Robert tapped the whiteboard with his marker. Then we need to be faster. The next few hours blurred into paper, calls, and controlled urgency. Annie compared more signatures. Eric traced routing logs. Patricia drafted a summary for the board. David built a timeline that began with Grace's second report and ended with Calvin's emergency agenda item. By early afternoon, the pattern was clear enough to be dangerous. Calvin's network had touched 12 appointment packets. 4 were already active. 3 had limited access to vendor or personnel systems. 1 temporary data security role would activate at 5, unless stopped. Every questionable packet carried either a forged signature or a suspicious digital approval routed through operations. At 2:40, Jonathan stood at the whiteboard, studying the map. Annie sat near the corner, tired enough that the lines on the papers seemed to move if she stared too long. Robert noticed. "Step out for air. I'm fine. You're not a machine." "I know. Good. Machines don't ask why the room is sick." That made her breathe out something close to a laugh. She stepped into the hallway. Through the windows, Chicago looked gray and hard, the streets below packed with cars moving like they knew where they belonged. Annie checked her phone. A text from Grace waited. "I'm home. Mrs. Alvarez is here. Don't let them use you." Annie typed back, "I won't. I promise." A voice behind her said, "Promises are expensive." Annie turned. Calvin Pierce stood near the elevator, hands in his coat pockets, as if he had been invited to wait there. His smile was calm. "Too calm. Relax," he said. "I'm not here to threaten you." Annie stepped back toward the audit room door. "Then don't talk to me. You're in over your head, Annie. You don't know where my head is. I know exactly where it is. Full of old stories from a mother who never understood how business works." Annie's chest tightened, but she kept moving backward. Calvin's voice softened. "This afternoon, the board will hear that Jonathan let a rejected applicant interfere with executive operations. They'll hear about your lack of credentials, your mother's history, the emotional bias. By dinner, you'll be out of this building, and by next week, no one will return your calls." Annie reached the audit room handle. Calvin leaned closer, still not touching her. "Poor girls should be careful with powerful men. They let you stand beside them until standing beside you costs too much." The door opened behind Annie. Jonathan stood there. He had heard enough. Calvin's smile remained, but his eyes changed. Jonathan looked at Annie first. "Go inside." She did. Then Jonathan stepped into the hallway and closed the door halfway behind him, not enough to shut Annie out, but enough to keep Calvin from using her as the stage. Through the glass, Annie saw the two men face each other. She could not hear Jonathan's first words, but she saw Calvin's smile disappear. At 3 o'clock, the board would gather. At 5, the data access would activate, and between those 2 hours, the truth would either become official, or Calvin Pierce would bury it again under better paper. Jonathan did not come back into the audit room right away. Through the glass, Annie watched him speak to Calvin in the hallway. She could not hear the words, but she could read the shape of the exchange. Calvin stood loose, one hand in his pocket, chin slightly raised. Jonathan stood still, not stiff, not loud, just still, the way a closed door is still. Robert came to Annie's side. "Don't watch him too long. I'm not scared of him." "I didn't say you were." Annie looked at him. "Then why not watch?" "Because men like Calvin know when they have an audience. Don't give him one." Annie stepped back from the glass. Patricia was arranging board packets at the table, each one clipped and labeled. David had built a timeline across 6 pages. Eric kept refreshing the data security workflow, where the temporary access for Calvin's nephew still sat pending, scheduled for 5 o'clock. There were 2 hours left. Robert pointed to the chair. "Sit." "I can stand." "I know. Sit anyway." Annie sat. Her phone buzzed. A message from Grace. "Are you near Robert?" Annie typed back, "Yes." "Stay there." Annie looked at the words, then placed the phone face down. She could almost hear her mother's voice in them, tired but firm, the kind of voice that had survived too much to waste fear on drama. Jonathan returned a minute later. His face was controlled, but something had sharpened in him. "Calvin will attend the board session," he said. Patricia looked up. "Of course he will. He is going to argue that the review has been contaminated." David asked, "By Annie? By Annie? By Robert? By outside counsel? By my personal involvement? He will call it emotional, irregular, retaliatory, and reckless." Robert gave a dry laugh. "That sounds like Calvin with a thesaurus." Jonathan looked at Annie. "He will mention you directly." "I figured. I can keep you out of the room." Annie glanced at the whiteboard, then at the board packets. Would that help? Patricia answered carefully. It might reduce his ability to turn attention toward you. Robert shook his head. Or it might let him describe her any way he wants without anyone there to prove otherwise. Jonathan watched Annie, waiting. She thought about the lobby, Marcia throwing her resume, the applicants laughing, Mr. Collins walking beside her so she would not look alone. She thought about Grace on the kitchen floor, still insisting she was all right. She thought about Calvin saying poor girls should be careful with powerful men. I'll be in the room, Annie said. Jonathan did not look pleased. He looked respectful of the answer, which mattered more. You won't have to speak unless asked, Patricia said. Annie nodded. If they ask, I'll answer. Robert slid a folder toward her. Then know what you're answering about. This is the clean summary. Don't memorize. Understand. Annie opened it. The pages were simpler than the others. Dates, packet numbers, names, departments, routing paths, signature concerns. She read each line slowly. The pattern was there, plain enough now that the excuses had to work harder. At 2:55 they walked to the boardroom. Annie had passed the frosted glass conference rooms and executive offices before. But the boardroom was different. It sat at the corner of the floor, with windows on two sides, and a long dark table at the center. The city spread below in gray layers, traffic crawling along the streets, the river cutting through downtown like a cold ribbon. The board members were already seated. Most were older, polished, careful with their faces. Calvin sat near the far end, not at the head, but close enough to look like he belonged there. He did not look at Annie when she entered. That was intentional. Men like him ignored people until the room was ready to help them dismiss them. Jonathan took his place at the head of the table. Patricia sat to his right. Robert and David took seats along the wall. Annie was given a chair near the side, not hidden, not centered. She preferred it that way. The board chair, a woman named Margaret Whitcomb, folded her hands. Jonathan, we received Mr. Pierce's request for an emergency agenda item. We also received your notice that several appointments have been frozen. I assume these matters are connected. They are, Jonathan said. Calvin leaned forward. Madam Chair, before Jonathan begins, I'd like to state my concern. We are dealing with a serious breach of process. Executive appointments were halted based on the visual opinion of an unvetted applicant who was rejected by HR yesterday morning. He did not look at Annie. Others did. Margaret's eyes moved to her, then back to Calvin. The applicant is present? Jonathan answered. Her name is Annie Brooks. She is present because she identified a discrepancy later supported by internal audit. Calvin gave a small, patient smile. Supported is doing a lot of work there. Robert shifted in his chair. Patricia touched her pen once to the table, a quiet warning to wait. Calvin continued. No one disputes that questions may be asked, but freezing appointments across departments, restricting HR access, and involving outside counsel before operations was even consulted is a drastic response, especially when the original source lacks credentials, company knowledge, or any clearance. Annie kept her hands folded in her lap. A male board member with white hair looked toward Jonathan. Is that true? This began with her? Yes, Jonathan said. The man frowned. And she was rejected by HR? Yes. Calvin spread his hands slightly, as if the point had made itself. Jonathan did not hurry. She was rejected by HR for lacking the kind of resume we usually reward. That is not the same as lacking the ability to see. The room quieted. Calvin's smile thinned. This is exactly the emotional framing I'm concerned about. Patricia opened her packet. The company now has 12 question signatures across 18 months, all tied to appointment packets routed through operations administration before HR processing. 4 appointments are active. 1 data security access role, tied to Mr. Pierce's nephew, is scheduled to activate today at 5. Margaret's face changed. His nephew? Calvin sat back. A qualified candidate. Temporary access. Properly routed. Robert spoke for the first time. Properly routed through a workflow that bypasses standard delay if HR and operations both approve. Another board member asked, who designed that workflow? David looked at his notes. Operations proposed it. HR approved it. Margaret turned to Calvin. Did you disclose the family relationship? It was known. Documented? Calvin paused. I'd have to confirm. Patricia slid a page forward. It was not documented in the packet. The room shifted. Calvin adjusted his cuff. An omission, perhaps, not fraud. Jonathan looked at him. Is my signature on the packet? Yes, Calvin said. According to the document. Did I sign it? I can't speak to what you remember signing. You can speak to whether you watched me sign it. Calvin's eyes cooled. No, Jonathan nodded once. Then don't lean on my name while stepping away from your own. Annie felt the room tighten. Margaret looked at Patricia. What evidence supports forgery beyond visual comparison? Patricia answered. Signature inconsistencies identified independently by Miss Brooks and reviewed by internal audit. Routing anomalies. Missing attachments in a prior personnel dispute. A historical report filed by Grace Brooks, Miss Brooks's mother, naming similar placement irregularities involving Mr. Pierce. That report was reclassified as a conduct issue and restricted by HR. Calvin gave a short laugh. There it is. The mother. Annie looked at him then. He continued. A former employee with a grievance. A daughter rejected by HR. And suddenly, we have a conspiracy stretching back 12 years. Forgive me if I find the timing convenient. Annie heard Grace's voice. Don't let them use you. Margaret turned to her. Miss Brooks, did you come to Reed Global yesterday intending to raise concerns about Mr. Pierce? No, Mom. Why did you come? To apply for an assistant job. And you were rejected? Yes, ma'am. Calvin's mouth curved faintly. Margaret asked, so why should this board trust your observation? Annie felt every eye on her. She could have defended her life. She could have listed every job again. Every night cleaning offices. Every hour spent helping Grace survive. But that was what Marcia had mocked. Stories, they called it, when poor people explained the work that did not fit on corporate forms. So Annie answered simply. You don't have to trust me, she said. Trust the pattern. No one spoke. She continued. I saw one wrong signature because my mother kept a real one. Mr. Haynes found more. IT found the routing. Legal found the missing disclosures. If I were wrong, the evidence would have stopped with me. It didn't. Robert's eyes stayed on the table, but Annie saw the smallest nod. Calvin leaned in, very rehearsed. Annie looked at him. No, sir, just true. Margaret held up one hand before Calvin could respond. Enough. At that moment, Eric entered the boardroom, pale and holding his laptop. Jonathan turned. What is it? Eric looked at the board, then at Patricia, then at Jonathan. The data security appointment moved from pending to pre-activation. David stood. It wasn't supposed to move until 5. It didn't activate, Eric said. But someone initiated a manual pre-check from an operations admin account. Calvin said, routine system process. Eric swallowed. No, sir. The pre-check includes audit trail validation. Robert stood now. Meaning? If it completes, Eric said, some logs can be archived and overwritten under the new access profile. Patricia looked at the clock. How long? Eric checked. 11 minutes. For the first time, Calvin's calm slipped. Jonathan saw it. Margaret spoke sharply. Can we stop it? Eric hesitated. The CEO can manually freeze the workflow, but it requires board acknowledgement once initiated. Jonathan stood. Then acknowledge it. Calvin rose too. Jonathan, think carefully. If you freeze a valid security appointment in front of the board based on this circus, you create liability. Jonathan looked at him. If I don't freeze it, what disappears? Calvin's voice hardened. You're making a mistake. No, Annie said before she could stop herself. Everyone turned. Her heart pounded, but she kept going. That's what people say when they need more time. Calvin's face darkened. You have no idea what you're talking about. Annie stood. Maybe not. But every time someone asks to slow down, something goes missing. My mother's report. Her attachments. The papers from our apartment. Now the audit trail. Robert looked at Jonathan. She's right. Margaret said, Mr. Reed? Jonathan did not hesitate. Freeze the system, he said. Eric began typing. Calvin stepped around his chair. This is reckless. Jonathan's voice cut through the room. Sit down, Calvin. Calvin stopped. Eric typed faster. The seconds seemed to gather weight. 7 minutes, David said. The room watched the screen now. A progress bar showed the pre-check moving forward. Eric entered Jonathan's authorization. A second prompt appeared. Board acknowledgement required. Margaret leaned toward the microphone built into the table. Board acknowledgement granted pending emergency review. Eric hit enter. The screen froze for one breath. Then a red banner appeared. Workflow suspended. Access denied. No one moved. Jonathan turned slowly to Calvin. At 5 o'clock, he said, your nephew will not enter my data system. Calvin's face had gone pale beneath the tan. Patricia closed her folder. Madam Chair, I recommend Mr. Pierce be removed from operational authority pending full investigation. Margaret looked around the table. No one objected. Jonathan spoke before Calvin could. Calvin Pierce is suspended from all company systems and authority effective immediately. Calvin stared at him, the mask almost gone. You'll regret this. Jonathan's answer was quiet. I regret not doing it sooner. Security was called, not Mr. Collins, but executive security from upstairs. Calvin gathered nothing from the table. He walked out with his hands empty, which Annie understood was not a small thing for a man used to carrying rooms in his pocket. When the door closed behind him, the boardroom remained silent. Annie sat down slowly, feeling her knees for the first time. Margaret looked at Jonathan. This investigation expands now. Yes, Jonathan said. Then his eyes moved to Annie. Not as a symbol, not as charity, not as trouble. As the person who had stopped at the paper before it fell, and Annie understood that the company had not been saved. Not yet. But for the first time, the lie had been stopped while it was still moving. For several seconds after Calvin left, no one in the boardroom spoke. The screen still showed the red banner. Workflow suspended. Access denied. It glowed at the front of the room like a warning that had finally learned how to speak. Jonathan remained standing. His hand rested on the back of his chair, but he did not sit. Annie watched him and understood that suspending Calvin had not relieved him. It had done the opposite. It had forced the problem into daylight, and daylight made the room colder. Margaret Whitcomb, the board chair, broke the silence first. Mr. Reed, we need immediate containment. Jonathan nodded. Agreed. Patricia opened her notebook. Calvin's access is frozen, but anyone tied to his administrative chain must be reviewed. Operations accounts, HR routing permissions, vendor portals, data security profiles, David added, and executive scheduling. If one of his people had access there, they could know when Jonathan was unavailable and time approvals around it. Robert Haynes stood near the wall with his arms folded. We also need to preserve every log before someone gets helpful and cleans the house. Margaret looked toward Eric. Can we lock the relevant systems? Eric wiped one hand on his pants before typing again. Yes, but it will slow down hiring, vendor approvals, and some finance workflows. Slow them, Jonathan said. Another board member, an older man with a red tie, frowned. Jonathan, freezing half the company's internal process will send a signal. Jonathan looked at him. Good. The man leaned back. Jonathan continued. For months, maybe longer, someone used my name to move people into this company. The signal should be clear. The door is closed. Annie sat very still. She had not expected to remain in the boardroom after Calvin was escorted out. Part of her wanted to leave before someone remembered she did not belong at that table. But no one asked her to go. That made the room feel more dangerous in a different way. Margaret turned to Patricia. What about law enforcement? Patricia answered. We have the break-in report involving Mrs. Brooks. If the documents connect to Reed Global's internal fraud, we should coordinate with outside counsel before making a broader criminal referral. Robert gave a short grunt. Legal language for yes, but carefully. Patricia looked at him. Carefully keeps evidence admissible. Carefully also gives crooks time. Jonathan raised a hand. Both of you are right. Patricia, prepare the referral. Robert, preserve evidence as if it leaves this building tonight. Robert nodded. Then Margaret looked at Annie. Annie felt it before the woman spoke. Miss Brooks, I want to understand your role moving forward. Jonathan's eyes narrowed slightly. Her role? She is a witness, Margaret said, a material one. She is also an applicant who was rejected by HR, then brought into an internal investigation. If we are not careful, any action we take involving her will be questioned later. Annie knew the words were not cruel. That almost made them harder. Cruelty was easy to recognize. Caution wore cleaner clothes. "I can go," Annie said. Jonathan turned to her. "That is not what she meant." Margaret did not soften, but her voice was not unkind. "No, Miss Brooks. I mean, if you continue assisting, it must be formal, documented, and protected, not improvised." Robert nodded. "She shouldn't be floating around on a visitor badge." David looked at Annie's badge, still clipped to the blazer Marcia had mocked. "She needs a defined status." One of the board members asked, "Are we discussing employment?" The word landed heavily. Annie's hands tightened in her lap. Employment. That was why she had come in the first place, before forged signatures and old reports and men breaking into her mother's apartment. Jonathan looked at her, not the board. "Miss Brooks came here seeking an entry-level assistant position," the man in the red tie said. "Respectfully, Jonathan, hiring her now could look like compensation for cooperation." Annie stood before she had decided to. "I don't want compensation." All eyes turned to her. She hated that, but she kept standing. "I came here for work," she said. "Miss Bell laughed at my resume because it didn't have the right schools or the right names. I still don't have those things. Finding something wrong doesn't make me trained. I know that. But I don't want anybody saying I was paid to tell the truth." Margaret watched her closely. "What do you want, Miss Brooks?" Annie thought of Grace's wrist wrapped in gauze, of the old folder under the sink, of the thank you letter that had spent years proving a woman mattered after a company stopped saying so. "I want a fair chance," Annie said. "A real one, with rules, with someone teaching me, with expectations I have to meet. If I fail honestly, but I don't want a favor wearing a badge." Robert looked down at the floor. David stopped writing. Jonathan remained silent for a moment, and Annie respected him more for not rushing to rescue the words. Then he said, "Create a temporary trainee role in the executive office. Paid, limited access. Supervised by David Ellis for administrative duties and Robert Haynes for document handling related to this investigation. Patricia will define boundaries. The board will review it." The red tie board member frowned. "That is unusual." Jonathan looked at him. "So was almost giving a data security role to Calvin's nephew under my forged signature." No one argued. Margaret leaned back. "I will support a temporary role, provided it is documented and not presented publicly." Annie looked up. "Publicly?" Patricia answered. "Media may find out." Annie almost laughed. "About me?" "About all of this," Patricia said. "And if they do, someone may try to turn you into either a hero or a liar. Both are dangerous." Jonathan's face hardened. "No press statement involving Miss Brooks or her mother without their consent." Margaret nodded. "Agreed." Annie sat back down slowly. Her legs felt tired now, as if they had waited until the decision was made to admit how long they had been holding her up. Eric cleared his throat. "System freeze is active. Calvin's accounts are locked. I'm identifying linked administrative accounts now." David's phone buzzed. He read the message and frowned. "Executive security has Calvin in the West Conference Room. He's refusing to surrender his company phone." Robert muttered. "Of course he is." Jonathan said, "Tell security to wait." "Patricia?" Patricia stood. "I'll handle it." Margaret said, "Jonathan, do not confront him alone." "I wasn't planning to." Robert took one step forward. "I'll go." Jonathan looked at him. "No. You stay with the files." Then his eyes moved to Annie, not as an invitation but as a check. "Miss Brooks, you stay here with Mr. Haynes." Annie nodded. After Calvin's hallway threat, she had no wish to see him again. Patricia left with David. The board members began speaking in lower voices, some frustrated, some alarmed, all aware now that the company beneath them had shifted. Jonathan walked to the window and looked out over Chicago. Annie remained seated. Robert came to stand beside her, holding a fresh folder. "You did fine," he said. "I didn't do anything. You stood up and told them what you wanted. That's doing something." Annie looked at the board table. "It feels strange." "What does?" "Being talked about like a risk." Robert's face softened a little. "People with power call you a risk when they realize they can't control what you know." That stayed with her. Across the room, Jonathan turned from the window. "Robert, where are we on the 12 packets?" Robert opened the folder. 5 strong signature concerns, 7 needing forensic review, 4 active appointments connected to Calvin's network, 1 attempted pre-activation stopped. Grace Brooks's historical file supports prior pattern. Margaret looked at Jonathan. Then our next step is clear. Independent forensic audit. Jonathan nodded. Company-wide. The red tie member looked startled. Company-wide? Yes, Jonathan said. Every executive appointment, sensitive access role, vendor approval, and HR override for the last 5 years. That will be expensive. Jonathan's answer came without hesitation. So was trust. The sentence quieted the room. Annie looked at him then and saw, maybe for the first time, not a billionaire, not a face on a lobby screen, but a man standing inside the damage caused by his own distance. He had not forged the signatures. He had not pushed Grace. He had not laughed at Annie's resume. But his name was on the building, and the building had learned how to hurt people without bothering him. A knock came at the boardroom door. David stepped in, phone in hand, face pale. Jonathan turned. What happened? David closed the door behind him. Calvin surrendered his phone, but David looked at Patricia, who had come in behind him. Patricia said. Before he handed it over, he received a text from an unknown number. Robert asked, saying what? David read from the screen. Storage problem solved. The Brooks originals are gone. Annie's breath stopped. Robert's head snapped toward her. Your mother's folder? Annie stood. No. We copied it, Patricia said. The message may refer to what they stole from under the bed. Jonathan's face went cold. Or they don't know she kept the real folder elsewhere. Annie was already reaching for her phone. Grace answered this time on the first ring. Annie? Mama, are you okay? I'm here. Mrs. Alvarez is watching me like I might run off. Is the folder safe? Grace's voice steadied. The real one? Yes. The copy Robert gave back is with me. Why? Annie closed her eyes. They think they destroyed it. Grace was quiet for a beat, then said, let them think. Annie looked at Jonathan. He understood before she spoke. Grace continued, sometimes truth needs a head start. Annie repeated it to the room. Robert smiled for the first time all day. Jonathan looked at the board, at Patricia, at David, then at Annie. Then we give it one, he said. The company-wide audit was no longer a recommendation. It was an order. Calvin was suspended. Marcia was restricted. The board had acknowledged the threat. Grace's documents were preserved. Annie had a role, not a favor. But somewhere outside that room, Calvin's people still believed they had burned the past. And that mistake, Annie knew, might be the first advantage they had. By late afternoon, Reed Global no longer felt like one company. It felt like two. One company still answered calls, scheduled meetings, sent invoices, greeted visitors, and carried coffee through polished hallways. The other sat beneath it, exposed and breathing hard, made of frozen accounts, copied files, locked doors, restricted badges, and people who had begun speaking in whispers because they no longer knew who could be trusted. Annie sat in the audit room with a temporary trainee form in front of her. Patricia had drafted it herself. David had explained each section slowly. Job title, reporting structure, pay rate, confidentiality, limited access, supervision. Annie read every line before signing. Robert watched from across the table. Good. Annie looked up. What? You read before you sign. My mother raised me. That she did. The title on the form read, Executive Office Trainee, Temporary. It was not the assistant job she had imagined when she walked into the lobby. It was narrower, more controlled, and tied to the investigation. But it had a pay rate. It had expectations. It had signatures that would be verified by legal, not passed through Marcia's desk. Annie signed her name carefully. David signed as supervisor. Robert signed as document handling supervisor. Patricia signed as legal reviewer. Jonathan signed last. In front of all of them. Annie watched the pen move. The last stroke bent. She did not say anything, but Jonathan saw her notice. That one real enough? He asked. Annie looked at him. Yes, sir. For the first time since the boardroom, a small breath of humor crossed the table and left quickly. There was too much work for it to stay. Eric came in with a stack of printouts and a face that said the news had grown. We found the source of several scanned signatures. Robert reached for the pages. Where? Old executive correspondence archive. Someone accessed high-resolution scans of Mr. Reed's signed letters and internal memos. Different dates, different documents. They built a sample set. Jonathan's expression did not change, but his voice lowered. From my own files. Yes, sir. David took one sheet. Who accessed them? Eric pointed to the log. That's the problem. The requests were made under a shared record service account. But the downloads came from a workstation near Operations Administration. 17th floor, Annie said. Eric looked at her. Yes. Robert leaned back. Same floor, same circle. Patricia asked, can we tie it to a person? Not yet. The shared account hides the user, but the printer metadata gives us more. Annie looked up. Printer metadata? Eric glanced at Robert, as if unsure whether to explain to her or around her. Robert said, to her. Eric nodded. Some color laser printers leave tiny tracking dots on pages, almost invisible. They can identify the printer model. Sometimes the device. Annie remembered Grace at their kitchen table years ago, holding 2 copies of a work form under a lamp. Mama had said, paper talks if you stop rushing it. The dots, Annie said. Robert's eyes sharpened. What dots? Annie pointed to one of the questionable packets. There are small yellow marks near the corner. I thought it was dust at first. My mother used to check things like that. She said machines have habits too. Eric pulled the page closer and angled it under the light. Hold on. He took out his phone, turned on the flashlight, and then asked for a magnifier. Robert handed him one from his drawer. Eric leaned close. Well, he said after a moment, she's right. No one spoke for a beat. Eric looked almost annoyed at himself. I mean, yes, there are tracking dots. Robert gave Annie a look that was almost a smile. Machines have habits too. Annie's cheeks warmed, but she kept her eyes on the paper. Can it tell which printer? Eric was already moving. Maybe. He left and returned 10 minutes later with a device inventory list. The questioned packets matched a secure printer assigned to Operations Administration, West Side, 17th floor. The printer required badge authentication for executive documents. David scanned the list. Who used that printer? Eric placed another sheet on the table. Over the past 18 months, 37 people. For these specific dates and times, 4 badge IDs. Jonathan stepped closer. Names. Eric read them. 2 administrative assistants. 1 temporary records technician. 1 senior operations coordinator, Elaine Porter. David frowned. Elaine reports directly to Calvin. Patricia wrote the name. Bring her in. Jonathan shook his head. Not here. Not yet. If she's involved, she may alert him. If she's scared, she may run. Robert tapped the table once. Interview her off the floor, quietly, and check whether she was the one who surrendered Calvin's phone. David looked at his notes. No. Security handled the phone. Annie listened while the names formed a chain. Calvin, Marcia, Elaine, the nephew, the shared account, the printer. She had thought fraud would feel like a dark room with one villain at the center. Instead, it felt like 100 small permissions. A password shared. A file reclassified. A warning ignored. A signature scanned. A printer used after hours. That was worse. Robert slid 2 pages toward her. Compare these again. Annie leaned over them. One signature was from a real letter Jonathan had signed 5 years earlier. The other was on a vendor compliance appointment. Sans imitation. Same forced ending. Wrong, she said. Robert marked it. David's phone buzzed. He read the screen. Security located Elaine Porter. She's in the cafeteria. Jonathan turned to Patricia. Go with David. Robert stays here. Annie looked at Robert. Should I go? No, Jonathan said at once. She stiffened. He softened his tone. Not because you can't. Because Calvin already knows your face. We don't give him more chances to reach you. Robert added. And because your job right now is the paper. Annie accepted that. Patricia and David left. The audit room settled into a quieter rhythm. Eric worked from his laptop. Robert sorted physical packets. Jonathan stood at the whiteboard, adding new names under the department circles. After several minutes, Jonathan said, Your mother really taught you to see printer dots? She taught me to notice when things didn't belong. She learned that here? Maybe. Or maybe she had to learn it because people here didn't listen unless she brought proof. Jonathan took that in without defending the company. My father used to sign every payroll check by hand when his machine shop was small. he said after a moment. He said a man should know whose names keep his lights on. I thought that was old-fashioned. When Reed grew, I built systems so I wouldn't have to touch every paper. Annie looked at him. Systems are only as honest as the people allowed to run them. Robert glanced up, impressed but silent. Jonathan nodded slowly. Your mother say that too? No, Annie said. I think I just did. For the first time, Jonathan gave a real, brief smile. Then his phone rang. He answered, listened, and the smile vanished. What did she say? Robert asked when Jonathan ended the call. Elaine Porter is talking. Eric stopped typing. Jonathan continued. She says Calvin told her the appointment packets were approved verbally by me but needed signature pages prepared for timing. She claims Marcia told her HR had already cleared the process. Robert's face darkened. Prepared signature pages. That's a clean way to say forged. She also says Calvin kept a private folder of signature samples. Where? His office safe. Eric said. Executive security sealed his office after suspension. Jonathan looked at David's empty chair, then at Patricia's notes. Get a warrant? Patricia had just returned and answered from the doorway. Not a police warrant yet. But as company property, with legal and security present, we can open it under policy if the safe belongs to Reed Global. David came in behind her. It does. Jonathan looked at Annie. Miss Brooks. You stay with Robert. This time Annie did not argue. They left for Calvin's office with legal, security, and IT. Robert remained in the audit room, locking the red-tabbed files in a rolling cabinet, before sitting across from Annie. You all right? Annie gave him a look. He nodded. Fair. She rubbed her thumb along the edge of her temporary badge. Do people ever get used to this? To what? Finding out the room is worse than you thought. Robert sat back. Some do. They call it experience. The better ones don't get used to it. They just learn where to stand. Where do you stand? Between the paper and the shredder, mostly. That made her smile a little. The door opened 20 minutes later. Jonathan returned carrying a sealed evidence bag. Inside was a flash drive and a folder of printed signature samples. Patricia carried a second bag with handwritten notes. David looked pale. Robert stood. How bad? Jonathan placed the bag on the table. Bad enough, Patricia said. The safe contained sample signatures, draft appointment pages, and a handwritten list of target roles. Some names are already in the system. Some were scheduled for later. David laid the handwritten list beside the whiteboard. He labeled it Transition Map. Robert read the words and swore quietly. Annie looked at the list. Departments. Names. Dates. A company inside the company. Just as she had said. Then her eyes caught a name near the bottom. Grace Brooks. She froze. Robert saw it. What? Annie pointed. Jonathan leaned over the list. Next to Grace's name, Calvin had written 2 words, Old Risk. Annie felt the room tilt. Patricia's voice was careful. That confirms he considered your mother a threat. No, Annie said, her voice low. It confirms she still was one. Jonathan looked at her then, and whatever remained of distance between Reed Global's founder and the young woman HR had mocked seemed to shrink again. Robert took the list and placed it into an evidence sleeve. Old Risk, he said. That man always did underestimate women who keep receipts. Annie thought of Grace's folder under the sink, the old thank you letter, the copies now sealed with outside counsel. She thought of Calvin believing the originals were gone. For the first time all day, she felt something stronger than fear. Calvin had built his plan around forged signatures, hidden files, and people too overlooked to matter. But he had made one mistake. He had not understood that overlooked people spent their whole lives learning to remember. Grace Brooks returned to Reed Global through the front entrance. Not the service door, not the loading dock, not the side hallway where cleaning crews came in after the executives went home. The front entrance, beneath the tall glass walls and the polished company name that had once meant a paycheck, then pain, then silence. Annie walked beside her. Grace wore a dark blue dress she had not worn in years, a simple coat, and low black shoes. Her wrist was wrapped, her shoulder still sore, but her back was straight. Mrs. Alvarez had offered to come, then changed her mind at the door and said, No. This one. You walk in with your daughter. Let them see both of you. So they did. Mr. Collins saw them first from the security desk. He stood. "Good morning, Mrs. Brooks," he said, though he had never met her before. Grace paused. The greeting landed somewhere deep. "Good morning, sir." Annie showed her temporary badge. Grace received a visitor badge printed by David, not HR. That mattered more than anyone said. Every detail had been arranged carefully. No one wanted Grace handled by the same department that had once reduced her truth to misconduct. Jonathan waited near the elevators with Robert and Patricia. He did not step forward too quickly. He seemed to understand that this was not a welcome home. It was a return to a place that had taken something and kept it too long. "Mrs. Brooks," he said. Grace looked at him. "Mr. Reed. Thank you for coming. I didn't come for you." "I know." That answer satisfied her enough to keep walking. As they crossed the lobby, employees slowed. Some recognized Grace from old years, most did not, but they recognized the tension, the guarded respect. The way Jonathan Reed walked not ahead of her but slightly to the side, as if refusing to make himself the center of her return. Annie noticed Marcia was not in the lobby. Good. She was not ready to see that woman near her mother. The elevator ride to the board floor was quiet. Grace watched the numbers rise. Annie wondered what her mother was remembering. The first day she had come here proud to have a steady job, the day she received Jonathan's thank you letter, the day people stopped meeting her eyes after she filed the second report. Grace did not say. She only held Annie's hand once, squeezed, then let go before the doors opened. The boardroom had been rearranged, not for ceremony, Patricia had said, but for record. A court reporter sat near the side wall. Outside counsel attended by video. Robert had the evidence folders stacked in order. David had the timeline displayed on a screen. Margaret Whitcomb sat at the head of the table until Jonathan entered, then nodded for him to begin. Calvin Pierce was not present. His counsel had requested delay. Patricia had denied the request for this internal session. Marcia Bell was present by video from a separate room, her access restricted, her face pale and stiff on the screen. Grace saw her and stopped. Annie felt it. Jonathan spoke quietly. "She will not question you. She is here because her actions are part of the record." Grace nodded once and sat. Annie sat beside her mother, not across the room, not behind anyone, beside her. Jonathan stood at the front. For the first time since Annie had met him, he looked uncomfortable in his own boardroom. 12 years ago, he began. Grace Brooks filed an internal concern about personnel placement irregularities involving operations. That report named patterns we are now seeing again. Relatives and close associates routed toward sensitive roles in finance, data, vendor compliance, HR, and executive access. He paused. The report was reclassified as a conduct issue. Supporting documents were removed before digitization. Mrs. Brooks was later marked as difficult, disruptive, and unsuitable for company culture. Grace did not move, but Annie felt her mother's breathing change. Jonathan turned slightly toward her. The company record was wrong. The words were simple. They did not repair anything. But they entered the room like a chair finally being pulled out for someone who had been forced to stand for years. Patricia displayed the documents. Grace's original report, her notes, the routing slip with Calvin's initials, the reclassification form bearing Marcia Bell's initials, the memo accusing Grace of creating racial tension, and the newly discovered transition map from Calvin's safe. Robert explained the documents in plain language. He did not dramatize. He did not need to. The paper did the work. Margaret looked at Grace. "Mrs. Brooks, you may speak if you wish. You are not required to." Grace looked at Annie first. Annie gave a small nod, not permission, only presence. Grace stood. For a moment, she rested her good hand on the table. "I worked in records," she said. "That sounds small to people who like big titles. But records are memory. They tell you what happened before people start improving the story." No one interrupted. "I found a pattern. I reported it. I thought that was my job. I thought if I brought proof, someone would look. Instead, I became the problem. I was told my tone was wrong. My concern was disruptive. My questions made people uncomfortable." Her eyes moved briefly to Marcia's image on the screen. "I was a black woman in a room where warning people made me angry, but silence would have made me professional, so they chose the label that helped them sleep." Marcia's lips pressed together, but she said nothing. Grace continued. "I lost more than a job. I lost the part of myself that believed doing right would be enough. My daughter watched me clean offices at night after your company wrote me down as difficult. She watched me keep one thank you letter like it was a photograph of who I used to be. Annie looked down, blinking hard. Grace's voice did not break. I am not here for revenge. I am here because the truth should not need 12 years, a break-in, and my daughter being humiliated in your lobby before someone decides to read the file. The room stayed silent. Then Robert said, very softly, Amen. Margaret looked at him. He did not apologize. Jonathan stepped forward. Mrs. Brooks, on behalf of Reed Global Technologies, I am formally restoring your personnel record. The conduct classification is removed effective today. Your original report will be entered into the company record as a valid internal warning. You will receive back compensation, lost benefits review, and damages through outside counsel. Not as a gift, as correction. Grace listened without expression. Jonathan continued. I am also asking, not assigning. Not expecting, asking. Whether you would consider serving as an independent records integrity consultant for the remainder of this investigation. Annie looked at her mother. Grace almost smiled. Almost. You want to hire the difficult woman to fix your records? Jonathan met her eyes. Yes. Why? Because the difficult woman was right. The answer landed harder than apology. Grace sat slowly. I'll consider it. Jonathan nodded. That is more than we deserve. Margaret turned toward the screen. Miss Bell, you may respond to the portions involving your initials. Marcia's face tightened. I followed the guidance available at the time. The environment was complicated. Mrs. Brooks made claims that were not substantiated through proper channels. Grace looked up. I brought the proper channels paper. You relabeled the channel. Marcia flushed. That is not fair. Grace gave a dry, tired laugh. No, Miss Bell. Fair is not what I would call any of this. Patricia leaned forward. For the record, Miss Bell, did Calvin Pierce recommend reclassification of Grace Brooks's report? Marcia hesitated too long. Margaret's voice sharpened. Answer the question. Yes, Marcia said. He recommended it. Did you independently review the attachments? I reviewed the summary. Did you review the attachments? Patricia repeated. Marcia looked down. No. Annie felt Grace's hand find hers under the table. Patricia continued. Did you mark the file restricted? Yes. Why? Marcia swallowed. Because Mr. Pierce said the matter involved sensitive personnel conflict and potential racial complaint exposure. Grace closed her eyes briefly. There it was. The phrase behind the years. Not fraud, not placement irregularities. Exposure. They had feared the appearance of racism more than the act of burying a black woman's warning. Jonathan's face went hard. Margaret spoke with care. Miss Bell, you are suspended pending termination review and referral to outside counsel. You will remain available for questioning. Marcia's video feed ended a minute later. No one celebrated. That was important. Annie understood it without being told. When justice arrives late, applause can feel disrespectful to the years it missed. The meeting continued with procedures. Legal review. Compensation process. Forensic audit expansion. Law enforcement referral. Protection for Grace and Annie. Jonathan ordered Reed Global to cover security repairs at Grace's apartment through a documented claim tied to the break-in investigation, not through personal charity. Grace accepted that distinction with a small nod. When the meeting ended, people began gathering papers. Grace remained seated. Jonathan approached, but stopped at a respectful distance. Mrs. Brooks. Grace looked tired now. Not weak. Tired. You should have read my report, she said. Yes. You should have known who worked for you. Yes. You should have wondered why someone who protected your company once would suddenly become a problem. Jonathan's answer was quiet. Yes. Grace studied him. Don't make my daughter your redemption story. I won't. She is not proof that you are good. I know. She is a young woman who needed work, and she saw what your trained people missed. Jonathan nodded. That is how her role will be treated. Grace held his gaze a moment longer, then stood. As they left the boardroom, Annie walked beside her mother through the hallway of framed company milestones. Grace slowed at one photograph from years ago. It showed a group of employees in the old records department. Younger Grace stood near the back, half hidden behind a taller man, But there, Annie had never seen that photo. Grace looked at it for a long time. "I forgot they took that," she said. "You're in it," Annie whispered. Grace touched the frame lightly. Barely. Jonathan, standing a few steps behind them, said, "We'll have a copy made for you." Grace did not turn. "No need." Then she changed her mind. "Actually," she said, "yes, I want one." Annie smiled through the ache in her throat. They reached the elevator. Mr. Collins was waiting downstairs when the doors opened, as if he had somehow known when they would return. Grace handed back her visitor badge. Mr. Collins took it with both hands. "Mrs. Brooks, you have a good evening." Grace looked at him. "You too, Mr. Collins." Annie noticed her mother's shoulders were still straight, but something had shifted, not healed, not forgiven, but returned, a little. Outside, the Chicago air was cold. Grace pulled her coat close with her good hand. Annie asked, "You okay?" Grace looked at the glass tower behind them. "No," she said, "but I'm clean on paper now." Annie took her hand. For Grace Brooks, that was not everything, but after 12 years of being called difficult for telling the truth, it was the first thing. 3 days after Grace Brooks walked out of Reed Global with her name restored, Annie received her employee badge. It was not handed to her in front of cameras. There were no speeches in the lobby, no article on the company website, no smiling photograph of Jonathan Reed standing beside a poor black woman he had decided to help. Annie had made one thing clear, and Grace had made it clearer. They would not become decorations for a company trying to look forgiven. David Ellis gave Annie the badge in a small office near the executive floor. Robert Haynes was there, along with Patricia Sloan and Jonathan. The badge was simple. Annie Brooks, Executive Office Trainee. Under that, in smaller letters, limited access. Annie held it in her hand for a moment before clipping it to her blazer. Jonathan noticed the pause. "Is something wrong?" "No, sir. You can say if there is." Annie looked down at her name printed cleanly beneath the company logo. "Yesterday this building wanted me outside. Today it gives me a badge. I'm just making sure I understand the difference." Robert leaned against the file cabinet. "The difference is paperwork," Patricia said, "and supervision." David added, "and training." Jonathan looked at Annie. "And your choice. You can walk away at any time." Annie nodded. "I know," but she did not want to walk away. Not because Reed Global had suddenly become safe. It had not. Calvin Pierce was under investigation. Marcia Bell was suspended pending termination. Several employees tied to the appointment packets had been placed on leave. The company-wide audit had begun, and every day brought another small discovery. An override here, a missing disclosure there, a hiring note rewritten to sound cleaner than it was. Reed Global was not safe. But now Annie understood something Grace had learned too painfully. Rooms did not become better because good people stayed outside them. David placed a folder in front of her. "This is your training schedule. Morning administrative basics with me. Document control with Robert 2 afternoons a week. Ethics and confidentiality modules online. Patricia will review anything involving legal. No system access beyond what's listed here." Annie opened the folder and read each page. David smiled a little. "You really do read everything. My mother says the sentence you skip is usually the one that owns you." Patricia looked up. "Your mother is not wrong." Jonathan stood near the window, quiet. He had been quiet more often since the board meeting. Annie did not know whether it was guilt or thoughtfulness, and she had no interest in comforting him through either one. When she finished reading, she looked at David. "Who do I report to first?" "Me, for daily work. Robert for investigation, related documents. Mr. Reed for executive office assignments. But those will be limited at first." Jonathan said, "Your first task is not coffee." Annie looked at him. "I don't mind coffee. I know. But we are not starting there because half this company already thinks low-level work means low value. Your first task is learning the calendar system." David nodded. "Which may make you wish it were coffee." Annie almost smiled. The first week was harder than she expected, not because anyone gave her impossible work, because the simple things were not as simple as outsiders imagined. Executive calendars had rules inside rules. A meeting was never just a meeting. It had time zones, security levels, attendees, dial-in codes, prep documents, conflicts, dietary notes, room access, and sometimes a quiet line from David. Never put those two people in a room without Patricia knowing. Annie made mistakes. On Tuesday, she scheduled a vendor call over a board committee hold. David caught it before it caused trouble. "Don't panic," he said. "I'm not panicking. You're staring at the screen like it insulted your family. I hate making mistakes. Then you're going to hate learning." She turned to him. David softened. "Listen, Annie. The goal is not to never make mistakes. The goal is to make small ones, catch them early, and never hide them. Hidden mistakes are how we got here." That stayed with her. On Wednesday, Robert taught her document logs. He showed her how every file moved, who requested it, who handled it, when it was copied, where it was stored. He made her write entries by hand first. "This is slow," Annie said. "Good. Good? Slow teaches respect. Fast teaches confidence before competence." She looked at him. "You talk like my mother. Your mother sounds like a smart woman." "She is." "I know." Robert said it without ornament, and that made it matter. At lunch, Annie ate in a small break room instead of the executive dining area. David told her she could use either. She chose the break room because she wanted to hear how people spoke when they forgot executives had ears. Some conversations stopped when she entered. Some did not. A woman from accounting asked if Annie was the signature girl. Annie looked at her and said, "My name is Annie." The woman flushed. "Sorry, I didn't mean it like that. People usually don't." An older man from facilities, Mr. O'Donnell, sat across from her later that week with a tuna sandwich and a thermos. "You Grace Brooks's daughter?" he asked. Annie braced herself. "Yes." He nodded. "She used to help me find lost maintenance contracts when nobody else would come downstairs. Tell her Mike O'Donnell said she deserved better." Annie's throat tightened. "I will." He took a bite of his sandwich. "And don't let this place polish you too smooth. Smooth things slip." That evening, Annie told Grace. Grace was sitting at the kitchen table, reviewing the copy of her restored personnel letter. She had read it every night since receiving it, not because she doubted the words, but because she had waited 12 years to see them. "Mike O'Donnell," Grace said. "Still eating tuna?" Annie laughed. "How did you know?" That man smelled like lunch by 10 in the morning. For a few seconds, the apartment felt lighter. Then Grace looked at Annie's badge on the table. "How are they treating you?" "Carefully." "That's not the same as well." "I know." "Jonathan," Annie thought about it. "He doesn't push. He asks before giving. He still thinks money can fix things faster than it can." Grace gave a small nod. "Most rich men do. But he's listening." Grace leaned back. "Listening is a start. Don't mistake it for the finish." "I won't." Grace studied her daughter's face. "Are you tired?" "Yes." "Good. Honest answer." Annie sat across from her. "Sometimes I feel like everyone is waiting to see if I belong." Grace looked at the badge. "Then don't waste your life proving belonging to people who keep moving the door. What do I do instead? Learn the work. Do it clean. Keep your name yours." The next morning, Jonathan called Annie into his office. It was the first time she had entered alone. The office was large but not flashy. Bookshelves, a long desk, framed patents, old photographs of the company's early team. On one shelf, Annie noticed a small black and white picture of a machine shop. Jonathan followed her gaze. "My father's," he said. "South Bend, Indiana, before he lost it." "I didn't know." "Most people don't. Poverty is more acceptable in a founder's story after the ending is rich." Annie looked at him. That was the kind of sentence Grace might respect. Jonathan placed a leather notebook on the desk and pushed it toward her. "For notes," he said. "Not a gift. Office supply. David has the receipt." Annie touched the cover but did not pick it up yet. "Why this one?" "Because cheap notebooks fall apart when carried every day, and because what you notice should be kept somewhere that lasts." She studied him. "You're trying not to make it charity." "I am. You're working hard at it." "I have a lot to unlearn." Annie picked up the notebook. "Thank you." "You're welcome." He sat, then gestured to the chair across from him. She sat. "I want to make something clear," Jonathan said. "You are not here to be grateful. You are here to learn and work. If someone treats you like a symbol, tell David. If someone asks for details about your mother, send them to legal. If someone tries to make you feel you owe the company silence, come to me." Annie held the notebook in her lap. "And if you do it?" Jonathan did not flinch. Then tell me. That answer mattered. By the end of the second week, Annie could manage basic calendar holds without David hovering. She learned which documents required watermarking, which meetings needed secure lines, and which executives smiled too much when they wanted something buried in language. She was not polished. She was not fast yet. But she was careful. And careful had already saved the company more than polished ever had. One Friday afternoon, Jonathan asked her to sit in on a short planning session about the company-wide audit communications. A communications director suggested a statement highlighting Reed Global's commitment to inclusion and opportunity. Annie kept writing until the phrase, "unexpected young applicant helped uncover irregularities," appeared on the draft. She stopped. Jonathan noticed. "Miss Brooks?" Annie looked at the communications director. "Don't make me the heartwarming part." The woman blinked. "I'm sorry? My mother was ignored. I was mocked. Someone forged signatures and broke into our home. That's not heartwarming." The room went quiet. The director looked embarrassed. "That wasn't my intention." Annie nodded. "I believe you, but intention doesn't change how it reads." Jonathan turned to the director. "Remove it. The statement is about process failures, corrective action, and cooperation with investigators. No use of Miss Brooks or Mrs. Brooks without written consent." The director nodded and made the change. After the meeting, Jonathan walked with Annie toward the elevators. "You were right to say that," he said. "I was scared. I couldn't tell." "I could." He gave a small nod. "Courage usually has better hearing than everyone else." Annie looked at him. "Did your father say that?" "No, I think I just did." She smiled then. A real one, small but real. 3 weeks after Annie first walked into Reed Global, Grace accepted Jonathan's offer to serve as an independent records integrity consultant for the investigation. She did it through a contract reviewed by outside counsel, with her own hourly rate, her own authority, and a clause that made Annie grin when she read it. "What?" Grace asked. "You added a clause saying no employee may describe your review as emotional, disruptive, or difficult without documented basis." Grace sipped her tea. "I'm not going through that twice without billing for it." Annie laughed so hard she had to sit down. The work ahead remained heavy. Calvin's lawyers were circling. Marcia's termination review was not finished. The forensic audit had found more irregularities than anyone wanted to admit, but Annie was no longer waiting outside the room. She was inside, learning where the paper moved, where the truth stalled, and which doors needed witnesses. One evening, as she left the executive floor, Mr. Collins was stationed downstairs again. He saw her badge and smiled. "Good night, Miss Brooks." Annie paused. The first day, he had said young lady. Today, he said Miss Brooks. "Good night, Mr. Collins." She stepped into the cold Chicago air with her notebook in her bag and her badge clipped to her coat. She still rode the bus home. She still lived in the same apartment. Grace still worried too much and kept receipts in envelopes by month. Nothing had magically become easy, but easy had never been what Annie asked for. She had asked for a chance. Now she had one with rules, witnesses, a paycheck, and work that mattered. And the next morning, she would come back early. Not to prove she was not useless, but to learn how much use a person could be when someone finally stopped laughing long enough to see her. 3 months later, Annie walked into Reed Global before 8 on a Monday morning and stopped just inside the lobby. The glass walls were the same. The security gates still gave their soft beeps. The elevators still carried executives upward with quiet speed. People still moved through the building with coffee, tablets, briefcases, and expressions that made every minute look expensive. But the lobby did not feel the same to her. Maybe it was because Marcia Bell was no longer behind the recruiting table. Maybe it was because Calvin Pierce's name had been removed from the leadership directory after the criminal referral became public. Maybe it was because the company had replaced its executive appointment process with one that required verified digital authorization, forensic signature review for sensitive roles, independent audit oversight, and mandatory conflict of interest disclosure. Or maybe it was simpler than that. This time, Annie entered with a badge. Mr. Collins stood at the security desk, reading the morning incident log. When he saw her, he smiled. "Morning, Miss Brooks." "Morning, Mr. Collins. You're early." David says early is on time when the calendar belongs to executives. Mr. Collins chuckled. "Sounds like something a man with too many meetings would say." Annie smiled and tapped her badge at the gate. It opened. That sound still meant something to her. She was not foolish enough to think a badge made the world fair. A badge was plastic. Fairness was work. But each morning it opened the gate. It reminded her of the day she had been escorted toward the door and had stopped only because a page tried to fall. On the executive floor, David was already at his desk with 2 phones, 1 laptop, and a cup of coffee he had forgotten to drink. "You're early," he said without looking up. Mr. Collins said the same thing. "Mr. Collins appreciates punctuality. I appreciate survival." Annie set her bag down. "What's first?" "Board audit update at 9. Vendor ethics call at 10:30. Jonathan wants the Grace Brooks consulting report in the packet, but not buried after the legal summary. Because if it's last, nobody reads it carefully." David looked up, pleased. "Exactly. I already moved it behind the timeline." "Good. And I flagged 2 missing conflict disclosures in the candidate review folder." David paused. "You did?" "Yes. One candidate shares a home address with a senior procurement manager. The other used a personal email that matches a vendor domain." David reached for the folder. "You checked the addresses?" Public record note was attached to the file. Nobody highlighted it. He read the note, then gave her a look. "Robert is making you dangerous. Robert says I was already dangerous. He's making me documented." David laughed once. "Fair." The morning moved fast. Annie handled calendar changes, printed secure packets, logged document movement, and corrected a conference line before 3 board members dialed into the wrong meeting. She was still learning. She still asked questions, but the questions had changed. They no longer came from fear of being exposed. They came from a desire to do the work cleanly. At noon, she took her lunch to the break room. Mr. O'Donnell from facilities was there with his usual tuna sandwich. "Miss Brooks," he said, raising the sandwich in greeting. "Mr. O'Donnell, you tell your mother I got that note she sent. Didn't need to thank me for telling the truth. She said people should be thanked before they die. After that, it's mostly flowers." He nodded. "That sounds like Grace." Annie sat across from him. Grace had changed too, though not in a way strangers would notice. She still lived carefully, still kept receipts by month, still checked locks twice. But her consulting work for Reed Global had given her something no check alone could have given. Her judgment had been requested in writing, paid for properly, and recorded under her own name. On their kitchen wall hung 2 frames now. The first was the old thank you letter from Jonathan Reed. The second was the formal restoration letter clearing Grace's personnel record. Grace had hung them side by side, then stood back and said, "One proves I mattered. The other proves I wasn't lying." Annie had asked if that made her feel better. Grace had answered, "Better is a big word. Clean is enough for now." After lunch, Annie returned to the lobby to deliver a sealed packet to legal reception. That was when she saw him. A young man stood near the recruiting table, holding a folder that looked painfully familiar. Thin, bent at one corner, clutched too tightly. He wore a brown jacket that did not quite fit and shoes that had been cleaned with care. His eyes moved from the company banners to the applicants around him, then down to his own papers. The new HR recruiter, a man named Paul, glanced through the folder and frowned. "No degree?" Paul asked. The young man shifted. "No, sir, not yet." "No internship?" "I worked at my uncle's repair shop. Phones, invoices, parts ordering, some customer scheduling." Paul sighed, not cruelly, but with the tired impatience of someone reaching for an old habit. "This assistant pool is competitive. Without formal experience, I'm not sure." Annie stopped walking. The young man saw her badge and straightened. Paul looked over. "Annie?" She stepped closer. "What position is he applying for?" "Office support trainee." She looked at the young man. "What's your name?" "Marcus Hill, ma'am." Annie almost turned at the word ma'am. She was still not used to it. "Marcus," she said, "what did you do at the repair shop?" He glanced at Paul, unsure whether he was allowed to answer. Annie waited. "I answered calls," Marcus said. "Scheduled pickups, logged parts, called customers when repairs were done. My uncle doesn't like computers, so I made a spreadsheet for inventory." Paul blinked. "That's not in the resume." Marcus looked embarrassed. "I didn't know how to make it sound right." Annie remembered standing at Marcia's table, trying to explain responsibility to someone committed to not understanding it. She turned to Paul. A resume can be short without being empty. Let him interview. Paul flushed. Of course. I wasn't rejecting him. I was just looking too fast, Annie said. He accepted the correction. You're right. Marcus looked at her. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Annie said. Interview well. Tell them what you actually did. Don't shrink it because it happened in a repair shop instead of a tower. He nodded, gripping his folder with new steadiness. As Annie walked away, she looked toward the security desk. Mr. Collins had seen the exchange. He gave her the smallest nod. By late afternoon, the board meeting ended with approval of Grace's records integrity recommendations. Every sensitive appointment would now require cross-department review, conflict disclosure, traceable authorization, and a whistleblower escalation path outside HR and operations. Jonathan called it structural correction. Robert called it putting locks on doors people pretended didn't exist. At 5:30, Jonathan asked Annie to stop by his office. She entered with her notebook in hand. The leather cover had softened from daily use. Its pages were filled with calendar rules, document procedures, phrases Robert used, warnings from Grace, and one sentence Annie had written after her first week: do not confuse being allowed in with belonging. Build the belonging honestly. Jonathan stood by the window, looking over Chicago. Long day? He asked. Yes, sir. Good long or bad long? Useful long. He nodded as if that answer pleased him. Marcus Hill has an interview tomorrow. Annie looked up. Good. You stopped that from going badly. I just asked Paul to look closer. That is often what stops things from going badly. She stood near the chair but did not sit until he gestured. He had learned to gesture. She had learned to accept without feeling ordered. Jonathan sat across from her, not behind the desk. The company will release its corrective action summary next week, he said. Your name and your mother's will not be included. The board agreed. Thank you. Grace's consulting contract has been extended. She told me. She said your records are a mess. She used kinder language with me. No, she didn't. Jonathan smiled faintly. No, she didn't. A quiet settled between them. Not awkward, not easy. Annie had learned that some quiet was where respect sat down. Jonathan looked at her badge. Do you remember what you said in the lobby that first morning? Annie almost laughed. I remember too much from that morning. You said you were poor, but not useless. Her smile faded. Yes, sir. Do you still feel you have to prove that? Annie looked past him, through the window, at the city where her mother had lost years and still kept proof under a sink. She thought of Marcia's laugh, Calvin's threat, Robert's granola bar, David's patient corrections, Mr. Collins saying Miss Brooks, Grace standing in the boardroom and making a company listen. No, Annie said, not like before. Jonathan waited. The problem was never that I was useless, she said. The problem was that people looked at what I didn't have and stopped looking at what I did. Jonathan absorbed that. After a moment, he said, that sentence belongs in a training manual. It belongs in a lobby. He looked at her. So nobody else has to say it while being laughed at, Annie added. Jonathan nodded slowly. Then we'll put it where people can see it. Annie shook her head. Not with my name. No name. And not as a slogan. What then? A reminder. 2 weeks later, a small plaque appeared near the recruiting area. It was not flashy. No marketing language. No photograph. Just plain lettering on brushed metal. A resume can be short without being empty. Look closer. Annie saw it for the first time on a rainy Thursday morning. Marcus Hill was in the lobby too, wearing a visitor badge, waiting for his second interview. He noticed her looking at the plaque. You write that? He asked. No, Annie said. I lived it. He nodded, understanding more than his age should have required. That evening, Annie left after sunset. The lobby was quieter, the glass walls reflecting warm light against the dark street. Mr. Collins was putting on his coat at the security desk. Heading home, Miss Brooks? Yes, sir. You tell your mother I said good evening. I will. He held the door for her, though she could have opened it herself. It was not because he thought she was weak. It was how he had been raised. And Annie had learned to recognize the difference. Outside, Chicago was cold again. The wind moved between the buildings, sharp enough to make her pull her coat tighter. She walked to the bus stop with her notebook in her bag and her badge tucked safely inside her coat. Her life was not transformed into something easy. Grace still had sore days. Bills still arrived. The bus still ran late. Some people at Reed Global still looked at Annie and saw an exception instead of a warning. Justice had come, but late justice did not erase the years it missed. Still, something had changed. Grace's name was clean. Calvin's network had been broken. Marcia's polished cruelty no longer guarded the door. Reed Global had learned, at a cost, that power without attention becomes a hiding place for betrayal. And Annie had learned that dignity was not something a company could grant her with a badge. It was something she had carried in with her, even when they laughed. At the bus stop, her phone buzzed. "Grace, you on your way?" Annie typed back, "Yes, ma'am. Grace, eat when you get home. I made soup." Annie smiled. The bus headlights appeared at the corner. She looked back once at the tower of glass and steel. 3 months ago, she had stood inside it with a thin folder and a sentence nobody wanted to hear. "I'm poor, but I'm not useless." Now she knew the sentence had never been a plea. It had been the truth arriving early, before the room was ready. The bus doors opened. Annie stepped on, paid her fare, and took a seat by the window. As Reed Global slid behind her, she held the notebook on her lap and looked toward home. Tomorrow, there would be more files, more meetings, more mistakes to catch before they grew teeth. There would be people to train, doors to question, papers to read twice. But tonight, Grace's soup waited under a small kitchen light. And for Annie Brooks, that was enough. Not because the world had become fair, because she had helped make one corner of it answer for being unfair. The lesson of this story is that a person's worth should never be measured only by a resume, a degree, a job title, or the clothes they wear. Annie walked into Reed Global with very little on paper. But she carried honesty, courage, sharp eyes, and the dignity her mother taught her. The story reminds us that injustice often survives because powerful people stop looking closely, while ordinary people are dismissed before they are heard. True justice begins when someone chooses to listen, to look again, and to admit when a system has failed the very people it should have protected. Annie's journey teaches us that being poor does not mean being powerless, and being overlooked does not mean being useless. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.